Chapter 1576. 1% of the grave god was horrified. Even though it was a soul clone with 1% of its power, no ordinary cultivator from Earth could withstand the power of this Eastfengli. But this male Earthling in front of it was clearly just at the body refinement stage. He had actually completely defeated Eastfengli with just his arms. 1% of the grave god was horrified. Could this Wang Jiao be a cultivator with a body refinement level of 200 million? How could there be such an outrageous existence in this cultivation world? He felt that he had to re-evaluate Father Wang's strength. The man in front of it probably wasn't as simple as he looked. After all, this was a human who had given birth to 2 monsters in a row. Even if it used its butt to think, the other party couldn't just be an ordinary Earthling. If he could tear apart his Eastfengli with just his arms, then the other party was definitely someone with deep secrets. I didn't expect you to have such strength. 1% of the grave god broke out in a cold sweat and slid down his cheeks. At that moment, the atmosphere instantly became very heavy. On the other side, Father Wang was actually also very flustered. As an artist who made a living with the keyboard, Father Wang had always been a scholar. When was the last time he had hit someone? He didn't know many martial arts techniques. At most, he was at the level of the national third set of radio gymnastics for middle school students, plus a little bit of military boxing. The person he was facing now was a big shot who had come to pick a fight with him, and was obviously a villain. Father Wang couldn't help feeling a little nervous. He didn't know who on earth this grave god was, he just felt that the other party was very oppressive. If it wasn't for the fact that Wang Ling had enlightened Father Wang's arms so that they were now like 2 electric water pumps, Father Wang's ability to withstand pressure. Father Wang felt that it was very likely that he would pass out on the spot in front of this grave god. The most frightening thing was that Immortal Toya behind him thought that he was a true senior expert. He was also fearlessly fanning the flames. Immortal Toya, my dear friend, Senior Wang's home isn't a place where you can come and go as you please. Senior Wang is a hidden expert. He doesn't cause trouble, and he isn't afraid of trouble. Senior Wang, forever a god. Father Wang, 1% of the grave god folded his arms and sneered. Do you know who I am? Immortal Toya, I don't care who you are, even if you're the overlord of the universe. If Senior Wang were to punch you, would you dare to take it? Father Wang, the 1% grave god frowned. You might not believe it, but I'm really the ruler of the universe. Immortal Toya, there's only one dad in this world. That's our Father Wang, Senior Wang. Who do you think you are? How dare you speak to Senior Wang like that? Quickly kneel down and apologize to Senior Wang. Listening to Immortal Toya's words, Father Wang looked calm on the surface, but he was actually panicking. Actually, it wasn't that he couldn't understand Immortal Toya's current mood. In the other party's heart, he was a senior expert who was like an idol. Since he had a worshipping attitude, it was normal for him to unconsciously use words to protect him. This was a common rule in online public opinion battles. No one can criticize my idol. But the current situation made Father Wang very nervous, and he really didn't know how to deal with it. In the face of the grave god, the pressure on Father Wang multiplied. But at that moment, he suddenly heard an overlapping voice in his head. The mysterious voice, "Don't panic, we're here." Father Wang, ? Had he been so nervous that he was hallucinating? At that moment, Father Wang was indescribably terrified. Don't be nervous. We're your left and right hands. Hearing this, Father Wang sucked in a cold breath. F***K. His left and right hands had actually turned into spirits after being enlightened. You don't need to speak, just communicate with us in your mind. I'm left hand. You can call me Little Left, or by my name, Kato. I'm right hand. You can call me Little Right, or by my name, Eagle. You actually have your own consciousness. Father Wang was completely petrified, and his mind was in turmoil. AI, we didn't want to come out at first. After all, if you knew of our existence, you might have to ask us to help you type in the future. It's probably every author's dream to have a pair of left and right hands that can move on their own. But the situation is urgent now. so little right, and I have no choice but to take action. So who on earth is this person? A person who claims to be the overlord of the universe, a living fossil who has lived since time immemorial. After gaining a little bit of strength, he became arrogant. Right now, his main body is fighting with the shadow clone that Anwan created in space. So, Anwan hasn't said anything until now because the shadow clone is fighting with this person's main body in space? That's right. Hearing this, Father Wang couldn't help trembling. He knew it. His daughter wasn't someone to be trifled with. She had just been born, but she had already started to maintain the peace of the universe. When she grew up, what would happen? But Father Wang had never expected that his opponent would actually be the overlord of the universe. Although the other party had given himself that title, it was obvious that he was someone with some ability. After little left and little right's awakening, Father Wang's nervousness subsided a lot. Because the following battle would be fully automated, and Father Wang didn't need to take the initiative at all. On the other side, the grave god in front of him actually didn't realize how serious the problem was. You must die today. 1% of the grave god's eyes narrowed. His arms stretched out from an extremely far distance as he suddenly grabbed at Father Wang. His 5 slender fingers were like the tentacles of an octopus as he charged at Father Wang in that instant. The grave god's movement was so fast that Father Wang couldn't predict it with his naked eye at all. But at that moment, he had nothing to fear. Because he believed in his son. And even more so in his left and right hands. He was the head of the Wang family's small villa. So when his family was in danger, he naturally had to step forward bravely and fight like a man. Charge! At that moment, Father Wang's blood boiled. He didn't say a word, but he was already roaring wildly in his heart. Mutta 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 mutta, little left and little right were even faster than 1% of the grave god. The moment they stretched out their 10 fingers, they began to split apart, and each finger actually grew hundreds of tentacles. Thousands of tentacles fell from the sky like meteors, falling down at an invisible speed, instantly destroying 1% of the graveyard god's arm. In the end, the tentacles bombarded 1% of the grave god's body countless times. 1% of the grave god's body was too horrible to look at. Smoke rose from all over its body, and it gave off a burnt smell. Then, its entire body disintegrated and scattered into dust. At the same time, in space, the grave god's true body spat out a mouthful of blood. Chapter 1577. The moment 1% of the grave god's soul was defeated by Father Wang's great wood chaotic fist, dying old master, the damage from the backlash was transmitted back to the grave god's body. He had never expected that the 1% of his soul that he had scattered to earth would be defeated. This result was difficult for him to accept. In fact, not to mention him, even the core members of the war sect were dumbstruck when they saw this scene. It turned out that Father Wang had decided to stand up like a man and face the 1% of the grave gods head-on. Immortal Toya broadcasted the entire battle live to the group chat of Battle Sect's core members. In the eyes of many core members of Battle Sect like grenade-throwing Senior Immortal, the seniors in the Wang family's small villa had lived modestly and ordinarily for a long time, staying at home with the air conditioner, connected to Wi-Fi, and experiencing human suffering. As far as they could remember, they had never seen Father Wang fight. But at that moment, Immortal Toya's live stream completely shattered everyone's memories, and was followed by cheers from all the core members of Battle Sect. This is Senior Wang? Senior Wang was so powerful. I've never seen him fight before. I thought he was just an ordinary person. Lightning Dharmaraja's eyes were filled with horror. He recalled the few times he had visited the Wang family's small villa to test Father Wang. In the end, because he was too timid, he did not dare to make a move. At this time, he was extremely glad that he had chickened out at that time. Fortunately, he didn't make a move. If they were to fight, would he still be alive today? This is what you don't understand, Dharmaraja. The seniors of the Wang clan are not ordinary people. I've thought so since a long time ago. Grenade-throwing Senior Immortal had a look of amazement and approval in his eyes, and at the same time, he deeply admired Father Wang. It was fine if he did not make a move, but when he did, it was shocking, as expected of Brother Ling and little girl Nguyen's father. A man who consecutively gave birth to two universe-level monsters. In some sense, grenade-throwing senior immortal felt that Father and Mother Wang were the strongest. In comparison, he would actually rather believe that Father Wang, Mother Wang and Grandfather Wang were very powerful people. If these three had all been ordinary people, then how they had given birth to Wang Ling and Wang Nguyen would probably be an unsolved mystery of the universe. Even if it was a genetic mutation, it shouldn't be this sudden. Meanwhile, on Sun Island, Lotus Sun stared at the scene before her in astonishment, deep in thought. He was one of the few people who knew that Father and Mother Wang were indeed ordinary people who didn't have the strength to truss a chicken. The girl subconsciously thought of Father Wang as the mastermind behind this attack. It had to be Wang Ling. From the content of the video, it looked a little like classmate Wang Ling's enlightening spell. Could he have enlightened Uncle Wang's left and right arms? Although Wang Ling didn't tell Lotus Sun about this. But with Lotus Sun's current understanding of the youngster, she was still able to guess most of the truth. Wang Ling was really too powerful. Uncle Wang, an ordinary person, was able to kill 1% of the grave god's soul with just a single enchantment spell. Although it was only 1%, but his opponent was a self-proclaimed overlord of the universe, an ancient being. With such a huge amount of energy, even 1% of the power was far beyond the level of the most powerful perfected immortal on Earth. It was only for an instant. Wang Ling's tall and imposing image in Lotus Sun's heart rose considerably. However, it's really shocking. Little girl Nguyen was just born, but she's actually able to restrain the grave god's true form. Wang Ming moved closer to Lotus Sun to watch the live broadcast. He was actually also a core member of Battle's sect, but he hadn't been added to the group as a way of avoiding suspicion. But this actually didn't stop him from obtaining information. If there was anything he wanted to know, he could directly ask Wang Ling. Now that Lotus Sun had been added to the group, he could also ask her about things Wang Ling didn't want to say. To put it bluntly, even if she was his future sister-in-law, she was one of them. Of course, while everyone was cheering for Father Wang and Wang Nguyen, there was one person who was out of the ordinary. This person was none other than Jai Yin. What are you talking about? I don't understand. Jai Yin had a puzzled expression on her face. It's nothing. Wang Ming took the initiative to say, it's just that little girl Nguyen was born just now, and Rong Rong is showing me a picture. Because he hadn't gotten grenade-throwing senior immortal's permission to be a core member of Battle's sect, Wang Ming had no choice but to play it safe. Ah. Little girl Wang Nguyen was born? Does this count as premature? Jai Yin was astonished. Is she very weak? Sort of, but she really isn't weak. Saying this, Wang Ming subconsciously glanced at Wang Ling listening to Jai Yin's words. He smiled bitterly in his heart. This premature baby in your eyes is now facing off against an ancient expert who claims to be the overlord of the universe. How can she be called weak? Seeing Wang Ming's expression, Jai Yin felt that she understood. Oh. I got it. Is little girl Nguyen as powerful as your younger brother the moment she makes a move? Wang Ming nodded and couldn't help pinching Jai Yin's cheek as he smiled. Factor, I realize that sometimes you're really slow on the uptake. This is too complicated, it would be hard for anyone else to accept it, Jai Yin said. Then, Wang Ming almost knelt down on the spot at her next words. By the way, how strong was little girl Nguyen when she was born? Is she already at the foundation establishment stage? Wang Ming, Lotus Sun, Wang Ling. In fact, Wang Ling had already noticed Wang Nguyen's birth in the waiting room. There was no active response. It was purely a sixth sense that stemmed from their blood relationship that made him realize that he finally had a younger sister. Far away on Sun Island, across the vast ocean, Wang Ling took a deep breath. Even from such a distance, he could smell the baby milk fragrance that came with little girl Nguyen when she was born. After having a younger sister, Wang Ling suddenly had a special feeling. He felt as if he was no longer alone. After so many years, all the loneliness and pain that had been sealed up in his heart finally had a second person to understand. A happy mood arose in Wang Ling's heart. But before this emotion could be reflected on his face through his brain nerves, it was suppressed by a force. Hence, little girl Nuan was born. On the surface, Wang Ling seemed a lot calmer than he had imagined. This was his sister's battle. He had actually been paying attention all this time. He paid close attention to every movement of the grave god's main body, afraid that the other party would be too ruthless and hurt little girl Nuan. But Wang Ling was actually very clear. The reason why little girl Nuan could not wait to be born was because she wanted to challenge this powerhouse of the eternal level universe. He had thought that he would be able to help little girl Nuan when she needed it the most. But looking at the current outcome, little girl Nuan didn't seem to need help, but just in case, Wang Ling still left the grave god a slap. Chapter 1578. He wasn't an ordinary person. The grave god's main body furrowed his brows. After losing 1% of his soul power, the pain from the backlash caused him to furrow his brows. Because of Peng Shiren's body, the grave god had inherited the benefits of the entire heavenly tomb. But now, the grave god found that he seemed to be restrained by this physical body. In the end, it was not as useful as his original body, because the strength of his physical body was lower than his original body, the pain of the backlash was doubled, and his flexibility was much lower than before. His heart was filled with amazement. Now, even he was beginning to doubt whether or not he could defeat this baby. I don't believe I can't kill you. The grave god's face turned pale. For some reason, the more he fought with Wang Nuan, the more he felt like a pathetic clown. In this uneasiness, the grave god began to frantically sacrifice the chaos weapons he had obtained in the heavenly tomb. The Grand Supreme Staff. He roared, holding a 6-winged Supreme Being staff in his hand, brandishing it towards Wang Nuan, stirring up a golden wave. Legend had it that it was made from the phoenix feathers of the time divine beast, the chaotic black phoenix. This was a wave of time that could make time pass rapidly. Those who were covered by it would be weakened and die of old age. However, to the grave god's surprise, Wang Nuan actually used her shadow Dao to replicate a Supreme Exalt's weapon. It was just that this Grand Supreme armament wasn't 6-winged. It was 66-winged. Little girl Nuan directly replicated and upgraded it to a Grand Supreme Staff with 66 wings, and it was a plus. An even greater wave of golden aging swept towards the graveyard goddess. Not only did they devour his time waves, but they also completely covered the grave god. The pain of aging caused many cracks to appear on the grave god's young body. After the waves had passed, his skin was completely sagging and the muscles all over his body had disappeared. He was like a piece of sponge that had been drained of water and had shriveled up. However, the power of aging did not kill him. The grave god absorbed the power of chaos in the space and used it to replenish his body, bit by bit, to restore his body. Then, in the following battle, the previous scene repeated like sit-ups. The grave god sacrificed, Celestial Night Spear. Wang Nuan copied and upgraded, Tianba Night Shock Shot Plus. The grave god summoned the Ku's shield, which was made from the skin of the most shameless author in history, Ku Xian. It released a light wave that slowed down Wang Nuan's movements. Wang Nuan copied and leveled up Ancient Wood Shield. The grave god summoned Primordial Whip. Wang Nuan copied and leveled up Primordial Whip Daddy. As the battle progressed, the grave goddess discovered an awkward situation. He thought he had earned the entire heavenly tomb with Peng Shiren's body. This was a very good deal. But he never thought that the little girl in front of him could use her shadow doctrine ability to replicate the eternal chaotic period that he had inherited from Heaven Tomb even if she didn't inherit it. In other words, the more chaos weapons he used in the heavenly tomb, the faster the other party would grow. Not only that, but he could also draw inferences and upgrade his Dharma artifact. No matter what kind of chaos weapon he used, it would be countered in the end. Suddenly, the grave god was shocked to find that he had become a tool. He carefully recalled the entire process from controlling Peng Shiren's body to successfully finding the entrance to the heavenly tomb and defeating the old woman guarding the tomb. The grave god's brows suddenly furrowed as she sensed that something was wrong. because everything seemed to be going too smoothly. How could a cunning old man like Dao Ancestor Wang only send an old woman to guard the entrance to such an important place like the heavenly tomb? The grave god had fought with Dao Ancestor Wang many times, so he had a good understanding of Dao Ancestor Wang's character. Now that he thought about it carefully, he felt that all of this was a calculated trap. If that old man had predicted that after he switched to Peng Shiren's body, his combat power would actually be limited. He predicted that the enemy he would face in the future would be this strange shadow girl in front of him. He predicted that all the Dharma artifacts he had inherited in the heavenly tomb would be countered by this girl. At that moment, the grave god didn't dare to continue thinking about it. To him, Dao Ancestor Wang was already dead. How could an old man whose whereabouts were unknown be able to predict what would happen today from 10,000 years ago? That was impossible. It couldn't be like this. Although the grave god didn't want to admit it, there was a little fear in his eyes at that moment. And now, the problem in front of him was Wang Yuan. At that moment, the grave god had no other choice. He had to kill the girl in front of him to prove that he hadn't been tricked by Dao Ancestor Wang. After thinking about it, he directly reached out to grab Wang Yuan. He didn't believe that as a heavenly ancestor, he couldn't even deal with a newborn baby girl. If he was defeated by Wang Yuan here, he would be forever engraved in the history of the heavenly tomb. However, what awaited him was Wang Yuan's merciless ravaging. A black square engraving appeared, which looked like something that the grave god had seen in the heavenly tomb. A huge pressure turned into the word human and bombarded his body. The grave god couldn't feel physical pain, but when these engraving hit his body, a terrifying energy burst out that penetrated deep into his soul. Then, the human character engraved on his body exploded after it sank into the depths of his soul. The explosion caused the tomb god's body to explode. It was as if he had just swallowed a few firecrackers. Human Dao seal. How could she have this? The grave god was even more shocked. This was because little girl Yuan had taken out a heavenly tomb chaos weapon that he had never shown before. Human Dao seal. This was a chaos weapon that the grave god found in a golden coffin in the heavenly tomb. It was very old, and although it was very strong, it was no longer as powerful as it used to be. It was so badly damaged that it couldn't be used again. However, the grave god didn't throw it away. He planned to keep it for now, hoping to find a way to repair it in the future. In the heavenly tomb, it was damaged like the human Dao seal. However, there were many powerful chaos weapons that were once famous in ancient times. The current situation made the grave god realize that something was wrong. He had never shown this damaged item before. This girl could actually use the ability of shadow to restore it, and even repair it at the same time. At that moment, the grave god was completely silent. This was because he thought of a shocking fact that he had to admit, that was, the little girl in front of him was very likely to have used his shadow Dao ability. She had replicated the entire heavenly tomb. P.S. There's a character design of the grave god in the Easter egg chapter, but it hasn't been colored yet. It's just a sketch to complete the grave god's current appearance. This is the appearance of the grave god after he took over Peng Shiren's body and merged with Peng Shiren. In other words, part of the human's appearance belongs to Peng Shiren. Chapter 1579. The moment the grave god recognized the reality, 5 words popped up in his mind. That was, how the F***ck was he supposed to fight? He had worked so hard to obtain the right to inherit the heavenly tomb, but it had been replicated by a little girl using her own power. This was a reality that the grave god did not dare to imagine or accept. Now that he was trapped in the shadow space, he was being restricted by Wang Yuan. Coupled with the continuous impact of the human seal, the grave god's face turned pale. He did not want to lose to a baby. Therefore, he had to think of a way to get out of this predicament. An immemorial level powerhouse, a being that had existed since the beginning of the universe. Countless people had turned into ghastly white skeletons over the eons, but the tomb god was still alive. The reason behind this was most likely due to the continuous accumulation of experience and some special factors. At this moment, the grave god stared at Wang Wan and pondered deeply. Although the current situation was extremely disadvantageous to him, he had never thought of showing his trump card in front of a girl who had just been born. He thought back to the battle between him and Dao ancestor Wang. He did not use that trump card even when he was on the verge of death. Instead, he endured it patiently. In the eyes of others, it was a psychological battle between the eternal realm powerhouses. The grave god knew that his final trump card was something that even Dao ancestor Wang was afraid of. Therefore, that old thing only dared to seal him separately and did not dare to kill him. That old thing knew his personality very well. If he thought that this was a dead end, he would definitely drag someone down with him. However, the current situation was not a dead end for the grave god. It was just a dead end. Just like a game of chess, he believed that as long as he played it well, he could still turn the tables. At this moment, the grave god's brows furrowed, and countless black seals seeped out of every inch of his skin, covering his entire body like crawling insects. At the same time, his evil purple eyes burst out with a shocked light, as if he was analyzing something. Immediately afterward, the grave god's face lit up with ecstasy, and he smiled again. I see. This is the power of the Shadow Dao. As if he had seen through something, he once again fell into a condescending posture. Facing the grave goddess, Wang Wan couldn't help but break out in a cold sweat. She didn't know why, but she did feel that the aura of this monster in front of her was different from before. He became much more cautious. Inside the Battle Sex Core conference room. Through the prediction, sword light, Audiobook released the image of the battle between Wang Wan and the grave god in space. It turns out that apart from cutting vegetables, pre-cooking also has such a function. Everyone was surprised. Foresight is the sword of prophecy, the sword of destiny. Sword light itself has the ability to analyze time and space, Audiobook said. The expression on his face should have been one of pride, but the situation of the battle and the universe seemed a little off. What is that grave goddess up to this time? I'm not sure, but I have a feeling that this person is different from before. It's like there's an additional aura of the great Tao. An additional aura of the great path? Very quickly, grenade-throwing senior immortal seemed to think of something, and he abruptly raised his head. Could it be that the other party can be like Brother Ling, and finish learning one Dao in an extremely short time? Has he learned little sister Nuan's Shadow Dao? That's impossible. Many of the core members were shocked and incredulous. They couldn't understand it, because it really made their scalps go numb. But there seemed to be only one explanation for the situation in front of them. When all was said and done, the other party was Eternal Evil God, who had given Dao ancestor Wang such a headache back then that he hadn't been able to completely get rid of him. Having this kind of ability was unexpected, but also reasonable. While everyone was pondering this, there was another upheaval in the universe's shadow space. The originally stable shadow space was now in turmoil, as if it was about to burst open. An extremely powerful energy fluctuation was released. This was the power of Shadow Dao, without a doubt. But the most horrifying thing was that it wasn't Wang Wan who had released this energy. There was a loud boom. The pre-broadcast image was instantly cut off. Elsewhere, in the waiting room for the Sun Island contestants. At that moment, Wang Ming suddenly felt his vision darken as a force stopped him and forced him to withdraw the brain waves he had scattered into the universe. What's wrong? Jai Yin walked over with concern and touched Wang Ming's forehead. It was very hot, but it wasn't his limit yet. Seeing this, Lotus Sun skillfully cast the temperature-lowering spell on Wang Ming. There was a ripping sound. A large amount of white fog was instantly released from the top of Wang Ming's head. Much better. Wang Ming heaved a sigh of relief. He had been watching the battle with his brain waves just now, and had directly linked them to the nerves of little Nuan's original body. Then, he had seen little Nuan's shadow fighting the grave god. There had been no problem at first, but in the end, in that second, after the grave god's devilish smile, the nerve link had been forcibly cut off. Ling Ling, something doesn't seem right. Wang Ming said as he rubbed his head. At that moment, He saw that Wang Ling was already sitting cross-legged in a corner of the waiting room, his soul out of his body and his mind wandering. Wang Ming couldn't help laughing. It seems that someone is more anxious than I thought. But before he could finish speaking, it only lasted for a few seconds. Wang Ling withdrew his thoughts and opened his eyes again. The reason was that An Wan still wanted to fight, and had chased him away. When all is said and done, she is an immemorial expert, and her combat experience is incomparable to An Wan's. You shouldn't spoil her so much. Besides, that person has already learned Shadow Dao. Her abilities and room for growth are beyond our imagination. Wang Mingming was clearly worried. It's fine. Wang Ling shook his head. His mind had wandered off just now. Although Little Nguyen had chased him away, he had made a basic assessment of the current situation. The grave god had indeed learned Shadow Dao in a very short period of time, and had indeed tried to use it to unlock the shadow space. Her learning ability surpassed that of all the opponents Wang Ling had encountered before. But unfortunately, the grave god actually didn't realize what kind of opponent it was facing. The purpose of Dao's existence wasn't just to imitate. Some people were born with heavenly Dao, but the very existence of heavenly Dao, as well as the order and rules established behind it, were all determined by the original creator. Since Wang Nguyen was the founder of Shadow Dao, she had supreme authority. Thus, it was useless even if the grave god had learned it. Because Wang Nguyen could confiscate it. Of course, the above order and rules, there was only one person in the universe who could ignore them. And that person was Wang Ling. Chapter 1580. The grave god's ability to learn was astonishing. Although Wang Nguyen had just been born, she had the memories of when she was just a cell. In Wang Nguyen's impression, before she was born, the only person in the universe who had such a strong ability to learn was her brother Wang Ling. She didn't expect the grave god to be able to analyze Shadow Dao in just a few short minutes. Furthermore, the grave god's goal was very clear. The instant he learned Shadow Dao, he immediately attacked the shadow space. The shadow space was Wang Nguyen's personal domain. If she kept fighting here, there was no way she could win. That was because the grave god's strategy was very clear. He didn't linger, but directly tore open an exit in the shadow space and fled. When Wang Nguyen chased after him, she saw an ancient decree burning in the universe outside the space, as if it was carrying out some ancient ritual. As the decree burned, a majestic horn sounded in the universe, as if thousands of soldiers and horses were attacking. For a moment, countless black ribbons crisscrossed in the surroundings. Some of the ribbons bombarded Wang Nguyen. Wang Nguyen HP -0. 001. It was hard to imagine that a newborn baby girl could actually survive unscathed in this chaotic, apocalyptic universe. This doomsday-like scene accompanied the burning of the decree. It lasted for several minutes, but it felt as long as millions of years. Wang Nguyen suddenly noticed that the surroundings were no longer like those on Earth. It seemed that the grave god had burned the decree. He had used the power of the decree to forcibly shift space. Girl, the land you're on is my core stronghold in the infinite universe. Those lowly Earth cultivators like to call places like this intrinsic spirit field, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. The grave god sneered. Above the intrinsic spirit field were the small world, the great world, and the core world. This was the ability of high-level almighty cultivators to create a world inside their bodies and construct nomological laws. If every cell in the human body was regarded as a living person, then the human body itself was an existence similar to the universe. And the universe they were in right now might just be a cell in another person's body. Of course, the ability to construct world nomological laws inside one's body was extremely strong. In such a world, the creator of the world was a god. Wang Nguyen frowned slightly. An existence even stronger than the core world was the core of chaos. It was a supreme world that was gradually built with the chaotic force of the universe as its foundation. Not many people could construct such a world. Only an ancient living fossil like the grave god could do it. Because the paramount worlds were too vast, they usually couldn't be stored in one's body. He could only choose another place to develop it. Such a mechanism was slightly similar to the Heavenly Dao experimental grounds that Dao ancestor Wang had created when he was establishing the Heavenly Dao, the unspeakable land. That was actually a type of supreme world, but it was a simplified version. The supreme world that Wang Yuan was currently in was led by the grave god, and it was tens of thousands of times larger than the unspeakable land. The sky was shrouded in purple chaotic clouds, and the barren and cracked land was devoid of life. Such a supreme world often symbolized the heart of the Creator. On top of a barren ancient mountain, Wang Yuan looked around. Every inch of land in this world was filled with graves. Written on it were all the ancient experts that the grave god had killed in the past. He was probably affected by the summoning decree and was forcibly summoned here. He was tortured by the grave god until he used up the last of his strength, lost his ancient glory, and was forever buried in the cold soil of this supreme world, after being summoned here. Although Wang Yuan had already turned off the grave god's shadow path, the person in front of her no longer cared. As expected, it's just as I thought. You are the creator of this path. The grave god's eyes narrowed. When he first learned the shadow path, he had focused his energy on tearing the shadow path space, and then set up a trap for Wang Yuan to enter his supreme world. His goal was clear: to break through the shadow path space. After achieving this goal, the grave god didn't mind even if Wang Yuan turned off the shadow path. In this supreme world, he was the true master. Although Wang Yuan had the ability to control shadows, in this world, the grave god also had the ability to control every blade of grass, every tree, and even every inch of shadow. This was not the power of the shadow path, but a type of authority that originated from the supreme world. It was equivalent to restricting Wang Yuan. Little girl, the situation seems to have turned. The grave god's voice was distant and lingering. It passed through the land of this supreme world, as if it could be transmitted to the other side of the universe. He floated in the air with his hands behind his back, slowly traversing the land under his feet. Every grave here belonged to an ancient almighty that he had personally killed. Among these people, there were some who were born as geniuses, but in the end, they still lost to him. Some of the names on these tombstones had already been worn away by time. Even the grave god couldn't remember who was buried here. He had killed too many geniuses and almighties, so it was impossible for him to remember all of their names. However, these people with tombstones were at least opponents who had lasted 3 minutes against him. Those who couldn't hold on for more than 3 minutes were like small mounds of dirt in this supreme world. These people didn't even deserve to have names. Little girl, you should feel lucky, because you will soon have a tombstone with your name on it, the grave god said. He looked at Wang Yuan on the top of a distant mountain. My venerable self will erect this tombstone on the highest mountain. Of all my current opponents, apart from Dao ancestor Wang, you are the one who has fought with me the longest. But once you enter this place, you won't have the chance to turn things around. As soon as he finished speaking, all of a sudden, a cacophony of voices rang out from all directions in the supreme world. It was as if millions upon millions of living beings were weeping. The powerful experts who had been buried in the ground throughout the ages were filled with a powerful sense of resentment that exploded out. It was like a flood crashing down on Wang Yuan, as if the sky was falling down. Wang Yuan, who had been confident in her victory, started to regret not accepting Wang Ling's help earlier. She had just been born, but her first opponent was an ancient overlord of the universe. The pressure of this supreme world was like a raging storm in her heart. Wang Yuan tried her best to stabilize herself, but this terrifying resentment was too strong. It seemed a little difficult for her baby body to withstand it. A baby is just a baby in the end. The grave god sneered at this scene. Seeing Wang Yuan's red face and how hard she had tried, he couldn't help feeling a little smug. The grave god pressed down with his hand, increasing the pressure again. He had thought that he would be able to take care of Wang Yuan very quickly. But what the grave god never expected was that when he decided to increase the pressure for the third time, a full 5 minutes had already passed. What a monster! The grave god was astonished. Ordinary 10,000 ancient realm experts wouldn't be able to last more than a few seconds under the pressure of his paramount realm. The person with the highest record held on for about 10 seconds. But the little girl in front of him had actually lasted 5 minutes under 50% of his world pressure. Should I use all my strength? The grave god's eyes narrowed. He had never tried using 100% of his world pressure before, because it was easy to cause the world to collapse if he didn't do it properly. But to completely destroy Wang Yuan now, the grave god was determined. Little girl, let's see how long you can last. The grave god didn't show any mercy. He pressed down with his hand for the 4th time, increasing the pressure from 50% to 80%. Then, he continued to increase the pressure. Under this pressure, Wang Yuan finally felt a little tired. She held her breath, and a teardrop squeezed out of her red face and fell to the ground. It was also at this moment. The grave god suddenly felt that his supreme world was being invaded by a foreign object. He didn't stop the pressure. Instead, he carefully observed Wang Yuan. He had a feeling that the little girl wouldn't be able to hold on for much longer. But the grave god didn't expect this. When Wang Yuan's tears fell, on that barren ancient mountain, there was actually a tender green blade of grass that grew against all the pressure. Then, a green protective sword light seeped out of the crack on the barren ancient mountain and gently wrapped around Wang Yuan. Chapter 1581. The extremely powerful sword light had a spirituality that could dispel all pressure, and instantly formed a resistance against the infinite resentment in the supreme world. The grave god was alarmed by this scene. He never expected Wang Yuan's tear to actually turn the situation around at this critical moment. In the waiting room, Wang Ling observed the battle from a distance, and at the same time shared the image with Wang Ming's mind. His 2 elder brothers were closely watching the development of the battle. So Leng Ming is here. I see. The moment he saw that green blade of grass appear, Wang Ming felt relieved. He was pondering a question. If Wang Ling was an immortal king, then Wang Yuan was an immortal sister. Then, Yuan's tear was the legendary, Sister Juice. The corner of Wang Ling's mouth twitched. He pretended that he hadn't heard anything. Leng Ming's appearance was within Wang Ling's expectations, because Leng Ming had a mechanism to begin with. Usually, it was the sword master's blood that could trigger this spirit blade that saves the master effect. This was a built-in rule for all the sword spirits produced in the Sword King world. As long as they recognized a sword master, the sword spirit would definitely appear at the necessary moment. But Wang Ling didn't want Wang Yuan to be heard in the slightest. Thus, he had specially modified this rule to specifically target Wang Yuan. It only took 1 tear to trigger this protective effect. In the Supreme World, along with Leng Ming's emerald green sword light, this barren and deathly still place seemed to glow with new vitality. The grave god was bewildered. He hadn't thought much of Leng Ming at first. It was just a small blade of heavenly tomb grass, which wasn't worthy of his surprise. But when Leng Ming appeared at that moment, the grave god had to admit that he was amazed by this blade of grass's growth. Leng Ming, who had appeared out of nowhere, looked like he had just returned from special training. He clearly had the body of a child, but he was clearly stronger than before, and he seemed to have grown a lot taller. He was wearing a grayish-green training suit with a belt tied around his waist. His whole body was filled with a kind of lively aura, like a spirit living in the forest. When the sword chi surged, Leng Ming's hair naturally floated in the air, emitting a kind of spiritual nature. With Leng Ming at the center, this barren ancient mountain was instantly covered in tender green grass. The wildfire will not be extinguished, and the spring wind will blow again. These grasses had unimaginable tenacity. In this supreme world that was filled with resentment, they were constantly being destroyed and reborn. To think that he could grow to such a level. The grave god clearly remembered Leng Ming's appearance when the Sword King realm was in chaos. It could only be said that the changes brought about by the current situation were too great. Don't you dare be presumptuous in my supreme world. The grave god became enraged, and the barren ancient mountain in front of her turned into an oasis in the blink of an eye. It made him feel extra dazzled. The graveyard goddess unleashed her final burst of power as she watched the withered and reborn grass spreading outwards like geckos. 100% of the supreme world's pressure. All of them bombarded down. In an instant, the wailing in this world grew even louder. Bitter and mournful screams and painful moans rose and fell, carrying a kind of heaven-collapsing wail. Billowing black gas surged over from the distant horizon, plunging this supreme world into an unprecedented depression. When the black gas approached, it transformed into people of all shapes and sizes. Their scarlet eyes emitted a hellish light. They were all ancient powerhouses who had been killed by the grave god. Now, they were all mobilized by the supreme world and sacrificed to become an undead army. They stood on black clouds and wore pitch-black undead armor. They were so eerie that even heaven and earth trembled. The vast undead army rushed over from afar and surrounded Wang Yuan's ancient mountain that was filled with lush greenery. There was a black mass below. Wang Yuan's ancient mountain had turned into the only oasis at this moment. It was like the last ray of light in this world that was about to be covered by endless darkness. Don't be afraid. I'll protect you. Leng Ming frowned slightly. He stretched out his strong little arm and shielded little girl Nuan behind him. His small body looked like a giant at this moment. This was also a test for Leng Ming. His first battle after returning from cultivation was already a situation like this. However, he was not frightened by the hellish scene in front of him. Instead, he kept thinking about the combat skills that his master and mistress had taught him during the special training. At the same time, he was measuring the gap between his side and the grave god's combat strength. This was the grave god's supreme world. In this world, the grave god could do anything he wanted. We can't waste time here. We have to find a way to split open this world. Leng Ming said this after some serious thought. The grave god laughed on the spot and clutched his stomach, as if he had heard the funniest joke in all of eternity. Do you think my supreme world is a watermelon? You want to split it open? Don't forget, you're just a blade of grass. Shut up. How would I know if I don't split it open? Leng Ming was in high spirits and refused to admit defeat so easily. Boom. At that moment, the undead army was even closer in the distance. The murderous aura of a deep sea of blood swept over with a destructive pressure. This was an unimaginable deterrent. Leng Ming was deeply shaken by the powerful fluctuations. He had never felt this level of pressure before. Even when he had been hit by Jinka and by Qiao's combined attacks, it hadn't seemed to be as great as this. Do you feel the gap? At that moment, the grave god slowly stretched out his hand, curled his fingers, and slowly closed his palm. With every inch of strength he exerted, the fluctuations of energy grew stronger. It felt like there was no end to it. Leng Ming started to get nervous, but he still persevered. He had come to protect Wang Yuan, and also to show off the results of his special training. He didn't want to embarrass his Shifu. Hey! At that moment, Wang Yuan slowly crawled over and lay on Leng Ming's back. The soft touch had the milky scent of a baby, and Leng Ming's little face instantly turned red. Ah, Yuan. In that instant, Leng Ming felt reassured. It wasn't just him, Wang Yuan felt the same way. Because of Leng Ming's appearance, the pressure from the supreme world had been split into two. Wang Yuan and Leng Ming were now sharing the pressure of this world equally, and had become each other's salvation. Wang Yuan didn't say a word, and hugged Leng Ming's neck like a soft plaster. In the next moment, the little girl's eyes turned sharp. Leng Ming instantly understood. The real counterattack was about to begin. Although little girl Nuan had just been born, her strategic thinking was exceptionally clear. She added the power of her shadow Dao to Leng Ming's body, and in a split second, the tender green grass that had been spreading all around them started to spread out at an extremely fast speed. The speed at which it spread was extremely astonishing, and it formed a green wave that collided with the grave god's undead army. She's actually using the shadows of these grass to counteract the withering effect. The grave god was shocked. He never thought that the little girl in front of him and that little grass would actually have such an unexpected effect. If this went on, his supreme world would be completely green. Chapter 1582. The grave god's expression changed. The overflowing green light in the supreme world started to spread, and the pressure of the world and the resentment of the army of the dead seemed to be naturally restrained. Wang Yuan and Leng Ming had a tacit understanding, and they instantly turned the situation around, which surprised everyone. A compass appeared in the grave god's hand, and his murderous aura soared as he gathered all his energy to resist the green light that had suddenly appeared in the supreme world. The two energies collided, and clanging sounds rang out, like the sound of the great Tao sweeping through the entire world. A black and purple bolt of lightning shot into the sky. The compass in the grave god's hand was formed from the core of the supreme world, and it was like the rudder of a captain on a giant ship. He had never used the full pressure of the world before, so he had to control the compass himself to make it more stable. No one can act presumptuously in my world. Gritting his teeth, he gripped the compass tightly and tried to put on a high and mighty posture as he released all his energy to stabilize the situation in the supreme world. Watching this scene from a distance, Wang Ling felt that the grave god was particularly miserable at that moment. He was like those emperors in TV dramas who had experienced coups but had no choice but to wave their golden swords helplessly. "Get down here!" Leng Ming shouted at that moment. His childish voice carried a kind of manly determination. There was a bang. The green light soared into the sky like a bonfire that lit up the gloomy world. Pooh! The grave god spat out blood and fell to the ground. He tried to steady himself, not wanting to kneel down. The core compass in his hand actually cracked under the combined pressure of Leng Ming and Wang Yuan. Who would have thought that a newborn baby and a sword spirit who had just been born and had only gone through a few rounds of special training would actually be fighting a living fossil who stood at the top of the universe? Moreover, they were clearly in the opponent's supreme world, but they were still able to suppress him. The grave god was astonished. This was clearly his supreme world. He was clearly the only god here, but these two kids had actually turned the tables on him. At that moment, Wang Yuan was lying on Leng Ming's back, as if she and her sword had become one. The grave god's expression changed. This little girl was terrifyingly strong. Even though she had just been born, her strength was unfathomable. Even though she had never had any combat experience, she had a strong learning ability and had grown rapidly in battle. He was like an old general who had been on the battlefield for a long time. He fell into a daze as he looked at Wang Yuan and Leng Ming. Rumble. The ground of the paramount world began to tremble. Powerful energy surged into the ground, and countless green lights were released from the cracks like fountains. The cracks on the core compass became even larger. The grave god found it hard to believe. The supreme world that he had painstakingly built for so long was about to be lost. Wang Ming was already completely stupefied. With Leng Ming around, little girl Nguan was like a tiger that had grown wings. He had thought that little girl Nguan might need his help to kill this grave god, however, he did not expect that this lass could do it alone. In some sense, he felt that little girl Nguan had actually been stronger when she had been born than Wang Ling. Unfortunately, she had been born 16 years later than Wang Ling, and this gap wasn't something that Wang Yuan could make up for just by relying on her powerful growth ability. Wang Ling's growth ability was also very heaven-defying, and was becoming more and more so. However, the reason why Wang Ming was watching this battle wasn't to compare who was stronger and who was weaker, or just to join in on the fun. Because of his research on the Black Stone, he felt that he could look for inspiration from little girl Nguan, who had just been born, and find a way to crack it. At least, that was what he had thought at the beginning, but now, as he watched the battle, his mind was blank. This fully verified the classic line, "Unfortunately, I'm uncultured, so I can walk the world with one F***K. The little girl was too strong, so strong that Wang Ming found it inconceivable. He had actually guessed that Wang Yuan probably wasn't a normal human being, but he had never thought that this lass would flip over the grave god's table as soon as she had been born. "For all you say, I'll split open this world, so I'll show you." At that moment, Leng Ming's roar rang out in the paramount world once more. His tiny body had an aura that could devour thousands of li, shattering all the haze in this world. A green sword light the size of a grain of rice condensed on Leng Ming's fingertip like a seed. Then, like dew, it slowly dripped down to Leng Ming's feet. In an instant, sword chi filled the sky. The invisible sword light shot up from under Lang Ming's feet. At first, it was only the height of a small blade of grass, and then it shot up rapidly. Indomitable. So dazzling that the grave god collapsed. In a split second, it illuminated the paramount world. A subversion had officially begun. Lang Ming's sword chi was too strong, especially with Wang Yuan lying on his back to transmit energy to him. It was like a clip-on power bank charging a phone. The most powerful clip-on power bank in the universe. This made the already astonishing sword chi even more frightening. In an instant, sword chi crisscrossed the paramount world, and hundreds of millions of divine lights tore through the sky, illuminating every dark corner. The army of the dead summoned by the grave god also stopped moving. They had been struggling and roaring in pain as they closed in on Wang Yuan and Lang Ming with the momentum of a magnificent army, eager to tear Wang Yuan and Lang Ming to pieces. However, at this moment, a miraculous scene appeared. These undead spirits that were summoned by the grave god froze as if they had been petrified. In this paramount world that was filled with Lang Ming's sword chi, all of them looked up at the green light in the sky, deep in thought. After a few seconds, Wang Yuan and Lang Ming both noticed that the murderous red light in these people's eyes had disappeared. It was as if they had been purified. This scene made Lang Ming hesitate. He did not make a move. Instead, he stood on the spot and watched this scene. He could feel that the pain in the hearts of these powerhouses who had been forcibly turned into dead spirits was being released bit by bit. He had originally wanted to use his own sword chi to sweep these people away. However, he did not expect that these dead spirits still retained a trace of humanity. Then let's transcend. Lang Ming sighed in his heart. He watched as many undead creatures in front of him turned into golden particles of light under his sword aura. Only then did he realize that these poor souls who had been trapped in this supreme world by the grave god had finally ushered in their own reincarnation after countless years. This was supposed to be a heartwarming scene. But at that moment, a mighty voice rang out. Kill! The grave god roared and attacked his army of the dead. You're all mine. I want you dead. You have to die. Losers like you only deserve to eat dust, not to be reincarnated. Don't get in their way. Lang Ming frowned. It looked like he was really angry. He clenched his small fist and swung it at the grave god. Boom! The green sword light turned into fist intent which swiftly rushed over from a distance and struck the grave god's body, instantly sending him flying. Wang Ling watched this scene from a distance. From his point of view, it felt like he was picking out a tiny ant from a sea of green. Chapter 1583. In this green ocean, the grave god was as tiny as a grain of sand. It was hard to imagine that this was happening in the grave god's own supreme world. He had thought that he was invincible in this supreme world, but he had never expected to be devoured by two children. This was an extraordinary humiliation. The grave god had never experienced this before. He struggled in the green ocean, and looked like he was in agony. Lang Ming controlled the sword chi to slowly cut through the ocean, and at the same time, approached the grave god. There was horror in the grave god's eyes, because he suddenly realized that he couldn't move. It was as if the green sword chi around him had grown countless hands to hold him in place. Guillotine. The grave god's pupils instantly widened as he thought of something. Hearing this, Lang Ming couldn't help but ponder. When all was said and done, he was an ancient living fossil, and indeed had more experience than most people. This move was called Green Grass Guillotine, or Green Grassland Guillotine. It was a spell that his Shifu Bai Qiao had customized for him based on his own characteristics. Supposedly, she had been inspired by a certain game, originally called Noxus Guillotine. All spirit swords had their own signature sword skills based on their characteristics. For example, his Shifu Jinka's signature sword skill was the world-annihilating sword. And this green grass guillotine was the signature that Bai Qiao had created for Lang Ming. Lang Ming never thought that he would be able to use it in actual combat so soon after learning it. At that moment, the vast green ocean formed from sword chi had already firmly enveloped this supreme world, and also restricted the grave god's movements. The green grass guillotine had already formed. Neither his body nor his soul could escape. This was a situation of certain death. Boom! As countless undead soldiers were purified and entered the cycle of reincarnation, the green sword chi that had been drifting slowly through the ocean pressed down and slashed at the grave god's frozen body. It only lasted for a split second. The grave god's body was split in two by the green light, and an extremely turbulent aura of primordial chaos poured out of his body. The energy inside him was astonishing. Leng Ming felt like he had cut into a big furnace that was about to explode. Very quickly, the grave god exploded, and a huge mushroom cloud rose with the grave god at the center. The shockwave from the explosion spread for billions of miles, as if it had spread to a very far place. Is everything over? Leng Ming looked at the scene before him and heaved a sigh of relief. He could sense that the aura of the grave god had disappeared. A universe-level figure of a generation, an existence at the level of an eternal living fossil, had perished along with the collapse of a supreme world just like that. It was truly a surreal feeling. Meanwhile, on the other side. After the grave god's aura disappeared, many people sensed it at the same time. In the infinite galaxy, Monk Golden Lamp was being treated by Crispy Noodles Dao Monarch. Wang Ling was a little worried about his serious injury, so he sent Crispy Noodles to take a look at him. When the monk arrived at the scene, he was covered in blood. He did not even have the strength to use the Buddha fire. Fortunately, Crispy Noodles Dao Monarch arrived in time. Thank you for your trouble, Dao Lord. Jin Deng sighed inwardly. In front of the grave god at his peak, Tyrant realized that he had no strength to fight back. He was still lacking in many areas. In the future, he would have to make full use of his time to cultivate. It's fine. Crispy Noodles Dao Monarch gave a gentle smile. Spirit light appeared in his palm and enveloped Tyrant. The truth was that he was just transferring the spirit power in his body to Tyrant, which acted like a power bank like Wang Yuan. After receiving enough spirit power, Tyrant had the ability to recover from his injuries. His aura really disappeared. At that moment, Tyrant raised his head and looked in a certain direction. That was the location of the grave god's supreme world. As an old enemy, the grave god's death made Tyrant recall a lot of things for a moment. It wasn't that he felt pity for him, but that it was a little strange. He had always felt that this old guy wasn't someone who could be killed so easily. In the astrolabe, Dusk and Peng Shiren, who were tightly connected to Tyrant and couldn't get away, also sensed that the grave god's aura had disappeared. He's dead. Peng Shiren's eyes were full of tears. F***K. How did he die? Why are you crying? Aren't you ashamed? Dusk glanced at Peng Shiren distractedly. Peng Shiren stomped his feet in anger. That's my body. He didn't give it back to me after using it, he actually exploded with it. Dusk was momentarily speechless. He didn't know how to comfort Peng Shiren. But as he listened, it seemed like Peng Shiren was the most pitiful person in this entire matter. His body was taken by the grave god, and his right to inherit the heavenly tomb of Wang Dao ancestor was taken away. Now, the right to inherit the heavenly tomb was gone, and so was his body. Most importantly, the grave god didn't leave behind a will before he died. There were so many treasures in the heavenly tomb, but now, they were all ownerless. Peng Shiren couldn't get them, so he could only watch. He planned so many things just to do something big, but in the end, he didn't get anything. Everything was for naught. It's not difficult for a progenitor to reconstruct a body. It just needs a little more time, Dusk said. Perhaps Peng Shiren's actual cultivation level had already reached the progenitor realm. This was the only good news. The reconstructing of a progenitor's body could be completely handed over to the bronze cat in the forsaken land of the gods. It just needed a long time. He knew that Peng Shiren was an impatient person. He probably couldn't wait any longer. This wait will take thousands of years. Peng Shiren felt pain in his heart. The feeling of being schemed against by the grave god was very strong. If he knew this would happen, he wouldn't have listened to that evil god's nonsense. But it was already too late to say anything now. Just as he was about to completely fall into isolation, Dusk said, "If you truly reflect on yourself, you might still have a chance." Peng Shiren said, "What do you mean?" Dusk said, "With my understanding of that evil god, he didn't even finish using that trump card. It's too strange that he died just like that." Peng Shiren couldn't help but feel surprised. Because what Dusk said was indeed the truth. "But, what is his trump card?" "Before the monk left, he told me, but I don't know if I'm right." Peng Shiren frowned deeply. "Unfortunately, your answer should be right." Dusk said, "But he can't completely use that trump card now. He only used some methods to obtain a 10,000th of its power. Back then, Lord Tao ancestor split up and sealed his soul, and sealed the more dangerous half of his soul in the heavenly tomb to separate that power. But what is that thing used for? I don't know the specifics. Neither the monk nor I have seen it. But since the Tao ancestor determined it to be a threat, it must be terrifyingly powerful." At this moment, in the supreme world that was about to collapse, Ling Ming floated in the void with Wang Yuan on his back. With the death of the grave god, this supreme world also fell apart at the same time. He stayed here for a while, using his sword energy to control this supreme world into a stable state of collapse. This was to prevent the rampaging sword energy from directly exploding this supreme world after he left. If that was the case, many innocent beings might be harmed. But soon, Ling Ming felt that something was wrong. The supreme world that was originally collapsing. It actually stopped, a dangerous aura assaulted them. This made Wang Yuan feel that the originally calm atmosphere had become tense again. She wrapped her arms around Ling Ming's neck and grabbed his clothes tightly. Ling Ming frowned deeply. At this moment, he was staring ahead. He finally found it. It was at the place where the grave god had disappeared. There was a piece of purple flesh the size of a fingernail wriggling and gradually expanding. Chapter 1584. Although Wang Yuan and Ling Ming were already mentally prepared and felt that the primordial heretic god wouldn't be killed so easily, they were still very surprised when they saw the evil piece of flesh wriggling again. "We have to strike first before it takes shape." Ling Ming frowned slightly. He wasn't stupid enough to wait for the grave god to really resurrect. There was no such thing as a melodramatic plot. Sun and moon sword light. Ling Ming raised his fingers, and a green aurora shot out from his fingertips, which blossomed like lightning in the air. The energy was even more dazzling than lightning. It gave rise to an astonishing power. It accurately collided with the purple piece of flesh. This, sun and moon sword light, was Ling Ming's original power, and its name implied that a blade of grass could cut down the sun, the moon, and the stars. This was Ling Ming's other unique skill apart from the grass guillotine. The difference was that it wasn't taught to him by Jinka or by Qiao. Ling Ming had comprehended it himself. The two quickly rubbed against each other, and then there was a big explosion. Ling Ming's sword qi collided with the squirming piece of purple flesh, creating a terrible glow and extremely high temperature that seemed capable of melting everything. However, when the smoke and dust cleared, not only wasn't the purple piece of flesh destroyed, it even swelled up. "An Wan. Help me." Ling Ming didn't believe it, and launched a second attack. He called out to An Wan. Little girl Nwan wrapped her arms tightly around his neck, and the universe's most powerful power bank was exerted again. 100 times. Sun and moon sword light. With An Wan's help, the dimension of the second sun and moon sword light increased again, and it carried a destructive power that could pierce through the universe. However, when the sword pillar of destruction, which was 300 meters in diameter, struck the piece of flesh, everything was like a clay ox that had sunk into the sea, and peace was restored once more. It had been clearly the size of a fingernail before. After Ling Ming's first attack, it had directly grown to the size of a palm. And now, with this second attack, it had actually grown to the size of a ku xian. "Is it absorbing my sword qi?" Leng Ming was alarmed. He had never encountered such a situation, and felt that it was very strange. This evil god wasn't an orthodox earth cultivator to begin with, but an alien creature. He felt that the scene in front of him might be related to the alien bloodline of this evil god. He could even rely on absorbing energy to reconstruct his physical body and wait for his resurrection. What kind of monster was this? This doesn't look like an ordinary cultivator's ability. Wang Ming was also thinking as he watched this scene from a distance. Although he didn't know what the grave god's bloodline was, he couldn't help but feel a sense of familiarity when he looked at the purple piece of meat. Especially when the purple piece of meat grew tentacles. Great old rulers. This was Wang Ming's first reaction. Legend has it that this is a powerful and ancient existence in the universe. Its existence is composed of unknown substances and laws that are far beyond the understanding of the mortal world. Therefore, the laws of the ordinary human cultivation world may not have any effect on it. For a long time, in the hypotheses about universal civilizations, there had been a stronger and more ancient civilization before the civilization of the cultivators was established. The ancient gods known as the Great Old Ones were the same. It was just that Wang Ming had only seen these things in related papers and books, and had never thought that they actually existed. At that moment, looking at this scene, Wang Ling had a few guesses in his heart. The mysterious object called Heavenly Mandate, which Nightmare had mentioned earlier. Looking at it now, the grave god had probably obtained part of that mysterious object's power. It was also this power that had reactivated the ancient god bloodline in the grave god's body, which had been diluted by the passage of time. In other words, the biggest trump card the grave god had always relied on was that he wasn't a part of Tao. Just like Wang Ling's king's eye. The laws of the ordinary cultivation world had no way of restraining these strange ancient gods of the universe. Now, Wang Ling finally understood Tao ancestor Wang's good intentions in sealing this mysterious object. He was worried that the old civilization of the universe would be revived because of this mysterious object, which would have a further impact on human cultivation civilization. At that moment, Wang Ling suddenly had a very interesting and dangerous idea. If this mysterious object was combined with a human cultivator without any ancient god bloodline, what kind of chemical reaction would occur? Wang Ling didn't show any emotion on his face. But he still had to admit that he was excited at that moment. He had been searching for an answer all along. That was, what on earth was his king's eye? Now, he felt that he might be able to find a new answer from this lump of flesh that the grave god had turned into, as well as that mysterious object. An Wan is in danger. This thing is too strange. Wang Ming subconsciously tensed up at the sudden change in the situation before him. He turned to look at Wang Ling. The youngster's mind had already wandered off once more, but this time, An Wan didn't chase him away. At the same time, the supreme world, which had already stopped collapsing, was being reorganized as countless dark fragments circled and flew around. These fragments were like a puzzle, and had a dark and destructive aura. The grave god hadn't completely revived, but that lump of flesh had already become infinitely large. It was the size of a sports stadium that could fit 100,000 people, and it floated in the air. Its purplish-black body was covered in some disgusting and unknown green viscous liquid, and it was surrounded by terrifying and complicated tentacles. Leng Ming knew. This terrifying resurrection ritual hadn't stopped yet. He had to stop the resurrection before the grave god Type 2 was completely formed. But at that moment, Leng Ming realized that he actually couldn't move under the enormous pressure. The terrifying creature in front of him had transcended time and time, and it actually instinctively gave rise to fear in his body. Rumble. One sound. At that moment, boundless holy light fell from the sky in the supreme world of shifting winds and clouds and boundless darkness. This was a new summon from the lump of flesh of the grave god. Wang Wan and Leng Ming saw human silhouettes appear in the descending holy light. Their faces couldn't be seen clearly, and they were all black and very tall, at least dozens of feet tall. Their upper bodies were human, and their lower bodies were tentacles like those of an octopus. Their faces were shimmering with a mysterious veil, and they looked extremely kind and benevolent. However, Wang Wan could clearly feel the endless surging brutality behind the veil. These were the guards for the resurrection ritual. Immemorial eternal, huh? At that moment, a familiar figure landed in front of Wang Wan and Leng Ming. Ling Jinren. Leng Ming's eyes were glazed over. When he saw Wang Ling appear, he suddenly felt the pressure instantly disappear. Hey. At that moment, Wang Wan climbed onto Leng Ming's shoulder with her fair little legs, and then jumped onto Wang Ling's back. Wang Ling felt a warm sensation from Leng Ming's body to Wang Ling's. Before coming here, Wang Ling had initially refused to cooperate with little girl Nguan. This ancient god of the universe in front of him wasn't an ordinary creature. It was stranger and more difficult to deal with than any of his previous opponents, and he was worried that Wang Wan would get hurt. But at that moment, Wang Ling changed his mind. Do you want to go too, An Wan? Wang Ling asked telepathically. Yeah. Little girl Nguan took the opportunity to lie on Wang Ling's shoulder like a soft pastry. Wang Ling felt as if his heart had melted. He suddenly felt that brother and sister mixed doubles wasn't bad either. Chapter 1585. These mysterious civilizations that had emerged from the very beginning of the universe seemed to symbolize the profundity and endless fear of the universe itself. Just by standing there motionlessly, they gave people a great sense of pressure and fear. This kind of fear came completely from the spiritual level, especially when it was beyond the common sense of an ordinary person. For example, before Wang Ling had appeared, Leng Ming had been intimidated by this mysterious and unfathomable power. It was as if it could directly penetrate the depths of one's mind. It wasn't until Wang Ling had appeared that Leng Ming's gradual loss of reason was forcibly pulled back. The spiritual pressure exerted by the ancient rulers could be said to be natural. This was an innate ability that they had as the creators of the early universe civilizations. If one spent too much time with these ancient gods in the same space, it was extremely easy for one's mind to collapse. Once this collapse reached a certain threshold, one would completely lose their mind. Wang Ling counted the immortals, who had been summoned by the resurrected god of the grave. There were more than 80 of them. These eternal beings were cloaked in holy shimmering light and shrouded in golden holy light. They didn't seem to have the slightest evil aura, and were like gods of the old universe, exuding an indescribable majesty. The primordial immortals moved their countless tentacles slowly forward. Wang Ling's face was as calm as an ancient well, but Wang Wan looked very uneasy. Seeing this, Leng Ming transformed back into his Xiaoqiao form and stood on little girl Nguan's head. Like a protective talisman, he emitted a green protective sword membrane. Even though Wang Ling was here, the scene in front of him still made Leng Ming feel uneasy. He had chosen to protect Wang Wan as a double insurance to avoid a situation where he couldn't take care of Wang Wan if a fight broke out later. This small action was exceptionally heartwarming. It made Wang Ling even more certain of his decision to choose Leng Ming back then. Wang Ling paused at the top of this ancient mountain for a moment. Gazing at the eternal beings who were wriggling toward him, he could indeed feel an increasingly powerful spiritual pressure. This supreme dark world, which was on the verge of collapse, had reached a strange balance with this group of summoned ancient rulers. Darkness, holy light, chaos, decay, these complex forces were intertwined. At that moment, apart from these old rulers and Wang Ling's group, there were no other living beings in the supreme world. But as he stood on the ancient mountain, he could clearly hear the screeching of countless crows in front of him, which sounded like the moans and cries of witches, constantly reverberating in his ears. It was indeed an extraordinary item. Wang Ling couldn't help but sigh with emotion. After all, in this universe, apart from the nightmare of not having crispy noodle snacks to eat, there were very few things that could give him enormous pressure. However, the pressure exerted by the great old ones in front of him was real. It was like he had never felt pain since he was a child, but now, he finally felt like he had been bitten by a mosquito. Chi! In the distance, under the illumination of the holy light, these primordial eternals who were slowly moving forward turned into layers of black shadows. It was hard to tell which one was real and which was real. With a hum, one of the primordial immortals suddenly appeared in front of Wang Ling and Wang Ling from a great distance away in a flash. Boom! There was a loud noise, and a powerful aura of chaos filled the air. It was incomparably dazzling, with the smell of annihilation. A huge pillar of light erupted with heat and powerful energy. Wang Ling raised his hand and cut off this blazing light of annihilation. With just a light wave of his hand, it had the effect of parting the sea, and the energy of annihilation instantly dispersed. Wang Ling never thought that these primordial immortals would actually try to destroy him in this way. This further proved that the grave god, who was about to awaken and evolve into its second form, wasn't an ordinary, old ruler. It was very likely that it was a top existence among the great old ones, or perhaps a powerful outer god. Or perhaps it was the head of the legendary omniscient and omnipotent demon gods, the so-called core source of chaos. Wang Ling was suddenly a little curious about the grave god's growth. These primordial immortals in front of him weren't weak, and even the patriarchs of those Tao god-level clans in the domain of the gods wouldn't be easy to deal with. But these primordial immortals seemed to have gone mad, and were using this self-destructive method to try to drag Wang Ling down to hell with them. Wang Ling took a deep breath. When the second primordial immortal self-destructed in front of his eyes, he felt that he couldn't wait any longer. Because if he continued to self-destruct like this, he felt that it would scare little girl Nuan. In addition to being very strong, these primordial immortals actually had one thing in common: they were ugly. His little sister had just been born. It would be terrible if she was traumatized by her childhood. But the truth was that these primordial immortals had in fact only just been born after being summoned. They didn't know that what they were about to face would also be traumatized by their childhood. At that moment, Wang Ling stood on the ancient mountain, a golden aura flowing around him. He wasn't a tall teenager, but his body exuded a great sense of majesty. As the red centipede spun, the three-petaled golden lotus in his eyes bloomed, and an overwhelming sense of oppression engulfed everything in front of him like raging waves. As far as the eye could see, everything was reduced to ashes. No one could withstand Wang Ling's destructive power. The benevolent and amiable attitudes of these primordial immortals, who were draped in golden holy light, began to completely change. They lost their last bit of dignity, and their shrill screams made all living beings tremble. Wang Ling's eyes emitted a terrifying beam of destruction. The astonishing power of the pupil seemed to have the power to reach eternity, and it could destroy everything. This gaze could be said to be impeccable. His gaze swept across the sky like a bolt of lightning to destroy the world, and the summoned primordial immortals fell to their knees. It didn't matter how distinguished they used to be, or how powerful the legendary gods they were. In front of Wang Ling, they could only kneel. In an instant, all the primordial immortals died. They disappeared in their own holy light and were annihilated into ashes. The moment the king's eye released its power of the pupil, the evolving grave god had mobilized these primordial immortals in front of him to fend off this fatal attack. Wang Ling didn't want to let the grave god off. He stared in her direction and tried to gather his power of the pupil again. However, the grave god's resistance was even fiercer than he had imagined. In this supreme world, countless dark doors opened again, and a nameless fog formed in the air. This was a fog that ordinary eyes couldn't penetrate, and anyone who fell into it would be surrounded by darkness. Then, they would instantly lose all sense of reason. Strange creatures with giant compound eyes and countless tentacles around their bodies poured out of the door in droves. Like a swarm of bees coming out of their nest, they charged in Wang Ling's direction with no regard for their lives. This was another type of primordial immortal, and was called the ultimate hunter. They weren't as big as the previous primordial immortals, but there were so many of them. Even though they knew they were going to die, they still blew their horns in Wang Ling's direction. Nuan would definitely be afraid. Wang Ling couldn't help feeling a little worried. He tilted his head slightly and watched Nuan's expression closely. At that moment, little girl Nuan was staring at these strange creatures flying at her at top speed, sucking her fingers and swallowing. Wang Ling, ? Chapter 1586. From a distance, the hunter of the end did indeed look like an octopus, but Wang Ling didn't have an appetite. No matter how hungry he was, he wouldn't have such a thought. But Wang Wan clearly didn't think that way. Looking at the hungry child next to him, Wang Ling's heart was inexplicably conflicted. Speaking of which, little girl Nguyen hadn't even had a sip of warm milk since she was born, and she had been in a hurry to fight this self-proclaimed overlord of the universe, grave god. Wang Ling felt that his little sister really hadn't had it easy. Since she was hungry, then she would eat. But would these octopus-like hunter of the end really taste good? Wang Ling had his doubts all along. Rumble. Up ahead, more and more hunters of the end emerged from the nameless fog, numbering in the tens of thousands. They were shrouded in a faint layer of black light, and their evil compound eyes were bloodshot as they bulged like huge millstones. Apart from that, there were other great old era creatures that were constantly coming out from the cracked earth. Earth-drilling demon worms, giant devouring worms, ancient wood mystic worms, these were existences that had only appeared among the gods of the ancient universe, and now they were all here. Like bamboo shoots after the rain, a dense horde of insects emerged from the earth. At first, there were only a few of them, but in the blink of an eye, they exploded like a geyser. In order to protect the evolving grave god, they had actually triggered round after round of gods that had only appeared in the ancient universe. Watching this scene from afar through the shared vision of the king's eye, everyone's hearts trembled. Lotus Sun covered her slightly agape mouth with her hand to hide her astonishment. This scene in front of her was definitely a trypophobia nightmare. She had never seen or heard of these terrifying ancient creatures, and just looking at them made her hair stand on end. Especially when the millions of demon worms, and mystic worms on the ground arched their bodies and moved forward at an accelerated speed. Lotus Sun could clearly see the thick purple-green mucus on the abdomens of these insects. When the insects were next to each other, the stomach-churning mucus intertwined and separated with a terrifying effect. Wang Ming's scalp went numb when he saw this scene. These old rulers of the ancient universe were beyond his understanding, and as the strongest brain on earth, Wang Ming was also trying hard to understand what was happening in front of him. At that moment, the Golden Lamp monk, who was in the midst of recuperation, rose as well. He saw what was happening in the supreme world through the swastika. Looking at your expression now, monk, it seems that what happened now is beyond your expectations. Crispy Noodles Dao Monarch saw it very clearly. As a real clone, he was an independent individual, but as long as Wang Ling agreed to his request to connect to the king's eye, he could also share his vision. There was actually a certain difference between Crispy Noodles Dao Monarch and Wang Ling, but when faced with this apocalyptic scene, they were surprisingly unperturbed. Tyrant frowned. I can roughly guess that he has obtained part of the mysterious item's power. Perhaps he would not die so easily. However, I didn't expect him to have the bloodline of an ancient universe god. Tyrant once had a partial understanding of the civilization of the great old ones from Dao ancestor Wang's speech. That era had happened a long time ago, far before the civilization of human cultivators, but for some reason, that profound ancient civilization had been completely annihilated. No one knew what on earth had caused such a powerful civilization in ancient times to be destroyed in an instant. As a symbol of the ancient universe civilization's past existence, the mysterious item that Dao ancestor Wang had discovered was one of them. Back then, His Excellency Dao ancestor knew how dangerous it was, which was why he tried to seal it. The monk said, it was said that when it was discovered, it was just an ordinary stone. His Excellency Dao ancestor kept the stone with him, and after a while, he heard a heartbeat coming from inside the stone. Heartbeat? Crispy Noodles Dao Monarch rubbed his chin and felt that he had heard something very interesting. So, this mysterious item called destiny is actually a fossilized heart left behind by an outer god in the ancient universe? This poor monk is not sure. Elsewhere, in the supreme world shrouded in chaos, the battle was still going on. Wang Ling felt a little uncomfortable looking at the densely packed insects on the ground. He took a deep breath, and the Naiwan palace in his mind shook. Boom! A loud, invisible sound spread out from Wang Ling and reached the minds of every living being in the supreme world. For a moment, space froze, and even time seemed to come to a standstill. Everything in front of them froze. Those hunters of the end in the air who were baring their fangs and brandishing their claws, as well as the crawling worms on the ground, were all petrified in that moment and didn't move at all. This was only 5% of Wang Ling's mental pressure, but when it was released, it was enough to intimidate everyone present. This was the pressure that Wang Ling usually felt when he was a functional body, as well as when he was on tenterhooks all day long for fear that he would destroy the world with too much force. It didn't seem like too much pressure, but after accumulating for a long time, it could reach a very frightening level. But Wang Ling hadn't expected that he would only release 5%. The creatures of the ancient universe in front of him were all intimidated by him. After a few seconds of silence, the insects that had emerged from the ground retreated under this enormous pressure. They burrowed back into the ground, moving in unison and extremely obedient, flying in the sky. These hunters of the end, who were known as the rulers of the past, crashed into the ground one after another. Then, Wang Ling jumped off the ancient mountain and began to examine these hunters of the end, who had fainted under the enormous mental pressure. Wang Ling crouched down and poked one of the hunters of the end with a finger. Whether it was the touch or the fishy smell on the surface, it smelled like seafood. All of this seemed no different from the grilled squid at a barbecue shop. The main reason why he had used mental pressure to intimidate everyone present was to ensure that these creatures of the ancient universe wouldn't have any meat left. After all, if he had directly used the king's eye's ability to release rays, these guys would have all died and turned to ash on the spot, and his little sister might not even have a piece of meat to eat. At that moment, Wang Ling sighed deeply in his heart. He didn't stand on ceremony, and directly plucked out one of the hunter of the end's tentacles, then used the most basic, palm flame spell, to roast it. It wasn't long before a fragrant aroma filled the air. Without any seasoning, little girl Nguyen directly bit down on the tentacle with a howl. But after chewing for a while, Wang Nguyen spat out the meat in her mouth. Because the meat of a hunter of the end didn't taste good. At that moment, she turned her gaze to the evolving grave god. At that moment, the grave god's resurrection ritual had already reached its final stage. The huge chunk of meat floating in the air gave off a dark yellow luster. From a distance, it looked like the yolk of a salted duck egg that was dripping with oil. Wang Nguyen swallowed hard, and suddenly felt that the grave god was even more delicious. Chapter 1587. Wang Ling realized a very serious problem. Although he and Wang Nguyen had been born in the same womb, little girl Nguyen's taste in food was completely different from his. Why did she always stare at strange things? And for some reason, he felt that after eating the hunter of the end's tentacle, little girl Nguyen seemed to have grown a little bigger. His body seemed to be bigger than before. It looked like Wang Nguyen had spat out that piece of tentacle meat, but she had actually eaten a part of it. Little girl Nguyen had her own picky tastes when it came to meat. The part that she had spat out was older. With a great battle at hand, she was well aware that her pitiful and small body needed to replenish its energy in time. Who told her to be a weak baby girl? At the same time, to ensure that she wouldn't continue to be a weak girl when she grew up, little girl Nguyen instantly realized a new skill. That was, to eat supplements. Back when Mother Wang had been pregnant with her, she had eaten all kinds of supplements and highly nutritious delicacies. Speaking of which, little girl Nguyen was now labeled a foodie. In fact, this was partly due to Mother Wang's prenatal education. When Wang Nguyen's gaze focused on the grave god's enormous piece of flesh in front of her that was emitting the light of revival, the statue also sensed danger. Although the grave god was just a huge piece of flesh now, it actually had spiritual intelligence. This piece of flesh was in fact an outer god embryo. Outer god. This was the most powerful lineage of the great old ones of the ancient universe. In Wang Nguyen's eyes, the golden light, which looked like a salted egg yolk, was a sign of revival. It flickered repeatedly on the grave god's enormous body at the rate of a heartbeat. It looked like a holy light. Set off by this supreme world of boundless darkness, the grave god's existence was simply like a miracle. Everyone who was watching this scene was shocked by the scene in front of them. It's far beyond the level of human cultivators. This was the first time even the monk had seen an outer god revive in the ancient universe. In his thousands of reincarnations, he thought that he had seen through countless scenes since ancient times, but this was the first time he had seen an outer god revive. "He's coming back to life," Crispy Noodles Dao Monarch said. This was a very special kind of fluctuation, as if it was sending a signal to the entire universe that a sovereign was descending upon the world. Due to the special nature of the signal, people of lower realms often could not receive this feeling, but the transmission of the signal would indirectly affect their emotions, work status, and even the possibility of gaining weight, insomnia, and depression. Such a special signal could be clearly felt by the upper almighties in the universe. Is he showing off his strength? Tyrant was terrified. Apart from Wang Ling back then, this was the second time he had felt this flustered. Even the supreme sage of Buddhism could not help but be shaken, let alone the others. At this moment, countless people in the universe raised their heads and stared in the direction of the supreme world that had been engulfed by chaos. At that moment, the crowd's expression changed. The divine realm, divine Tao star, the domain of the gods, the demon realm, as well as those explored and unexplored civilizations in the universe, the upper almighties among all the living creatures felt it hard to breathe. They could not tell what this power was, nor did they know if it represented evil or justice. But the pain of being strangled gave everyone the feeling that the universe was about to fall into chaos. No one could have imagined that a powerful creature of the ancient universe was about to be resurrected. And it was. The most powerful creature among the rulers of the past, the outer gods. In the next moment, almost all the planetary civilizations that received this signal opened their own defensive barriers. They didn't know if this shallow barrier would really work. But at the very least, it could provide them with some psychological comfort. At that moment, the Wang siblings, Wang Ling and Wang Yuan, were in the chaotic storm of the supreme world. The giant piece of meat, which shone with a golden light, was terrifying and holy with a hint of sulfa air. Endless nameless fog formed around it, as if it could connect to every corner of the universe. Wang Ling raised his hand and used the strength of his ordinary palm to create a hurricane that hit the nameless fog. After the nameless fog was blown away, it actually regenerated in its original spot in a seamless manner. There was only a little bit of time left before the grave god's official resurrection. Die. At that moment, Wang Ling heard the grave god's ancient voice full of murderous intent coming from the giant piece of golden meat, which reverberated throughout the supreme world. Like a giant mirage, the ancient god palace had appeared here in response to the grave god's summons. This ancient god palace seemed illusory yet real at the same time. Every ancient pillar and wall was engraved with cryptic runes that filled the sky and gave off an intimidating glow. Wang Ling rolled up his sleeves, intending to smash the palace with one punch. But at that moment, he saw through his king's eye that there was actually a three-petaled golden lotus with tentacles as its roots inside the ancient god palace. This instantly dispelled Wang Ling's idea of smashing the ancient god palace with one punch. Because this three-petaled golden lotus seemed to be closely connected to his king's eye, every time he released his power, a three-petaled golden lotus would bloom in his pupil. But from the outside, the golden lotus in this ancient god palace was slightly different from the one in the king's eye. Was he only able to go in and take a look? Wang Ling had been investigating the king's eye for many years, and it hadn't been easy for him to find a clue, so he wasn't going to give up so easily. Sorry, An Wan. At that moment, Wang Ling stretched out his hand to rub his sister's head. Exploring the ancient god palace would undoubtedly take time, which meant that An Wan might have to go hungry for a while longer. To be on the safe side, Wang Ling picked a few of the unconscious hunters of the end who looked the most tender and put them into his king's eye. What if there was some seasoning in the ancient god palace? Maybe these hunters of the end would taste better. Outer God Palace. At that moment, Monk Golden Lamp also saw this frightening scene through the swastika. He had seen a similar building in Dao ancestor Wang's public notes back then, so after observing it for a while, he recalled it. What is Ling Jinren doing? You mustn't go in. It's too dangerous. His expression changed dramatically in astonishment. Because it was written in Dao ancestor Wang's notes back then. Outer God Palace, that was a place of no return. Dao ancestor Wang had once sent out several real clones to explore the Outer God Palace, but in the end, none of them had returned. They had all lost contact with the palace. This was an existence even more terrifying than the highest world. It was the same as walking into someone else's laws. And the most frightening thing was that the Outer God Palace was in the highest world at the moment. If Wang Ling went inside, it was equivalent to being shackled twice. The monk had never dealt with the creatures of the ancient universe, but when he sensed that heart-palpitating aura for the second time since his last fight with Wang Ling, Monk Golden Lamp already felt that the situation was very bad. On the other side, the grave god didn't expect the teenager in front of him to take the initiative to walk into his Outer God Palace. Highest world plus Outer God Palace. This combination was incomparably stressful. He didn't know if Wang Ling was stupid, but he had actually walked into the cage he had set up. Not only had he come in himself, he had actually brought his sister in. But this way, the grave god felt that it had saved him a lot of trouble. Heh, what an interesting pair of little fellows. At that moment, the grave god, who was on the verge of fully evolving into an outer god, felt that he had the power to understand everything in the universe. He gazed at the brother and sister pair who had stepped into the Outer God Palace. The moment Wang Ling entered the main entrance, the grave god had firmly sealed and locked the palace door. Until that moment, the grave god hadn't expected this. He had just let a demolition team in. Chapter 1588. When Wang Ling stepped into the Outer God Palace, he was a little surprised by the powerful aura of the ancient universe inside. It was actually much stronger than he had imagined. This outer deity palace was clearly a trap. The chaotic chi inside was millions of times denser than the unspeakable land's periphery. Even the monk's realm wasn't enough to set foot here. Wang Ling wasn't used to it at first, but after standing still for a few seconds, he quickly familiarized himself with his surroundings. He had wanted to protect An Wan, but in the end, An Wan's adaptability was stronger than he had imagined. What an outrageous little guy. Wang Ling sighed in his heart. At that moment, Wang Ling was in the main hall on the outermost layer of the palace. This room was actually the size of a small world. To actually use a small world to divide the rooms in the palace, Wang Ling couldn't help but marvel at the extravagance of the outer gods. This wasn't something that belonged to the grave god, but something that the grave god had inherited after using the power of a mysterious object to activate the outer god bloodline in his body. In essence, this terrifying outer god palace should have been like those ghost ships drifting in the deep sea, drifting with the tide of time and eternally suspended in space. No one would have thought that the outer god palace would actually appear again one day. Looking ahead with the king's eye, Wang Ling found 3 entrances in this room that was as vast as a small world beneath his feet. They led to the 3 rooms at the back. The king's eye's line of sight was blocked by a golden light, so he couldn't clearly see what was behind the rooms. Wang Ling felt that this light had a lot to do with the 3-petal golden lotus he had seen outside for a moment. Although Wang Ling couldn't see what was behind these 3 rooms, he had nothing to be afraid of. It was just that the biggest problem in front of him was, he had difficulty making a choice. Faced with the 3 entrances that appeared in his line of sight, Wang Ling became a little conflicted. At that moment, Nwan gave a "ya" and pointed to one of the entrances. The third one? Wang Ling couldn't be bothered to think too much about it, and naturally trusted Nwan's choice unconditionally. When Wang Ling made up his mind, a dazzling light suddenly lit up in the small world and turned into a golden path that led directly from under Wang Ling's feet to the 3rd entrance. This was a restriction in the Outer God Palace. It was to prevent the people who entered from changing their minds after making a decision. Staring at the golden path under his feet, Wang Ling sighed helplessly in his heart. For some reason, he felt that this Outer God Palace was a little like a game. This golden path was very long and stretched for thousands of miles. After all, every room in the Outer God's palace was a small world. If an ordinary person came here, they would have to consume a lot of spiritual energy on the way. But Wang Ling wasn't afraid. He directly used the ground shrinking technique and easily approached the entrance to the next room. Stepping into the entrance covered in golden light, Wang Ling entered the next space. Next, the siblings began to carefully observe the scenery before them, not letting go of any anomalies. In the second room, there was another small world. Wang Ling and Wang Wan heard shrill screams, and they saw a withered forest several hundred li ahead. His body moved, and like a ray of light, he arrived in an instant. A startling scene appeared in front of them. Before Wang Ling could cover Wang Wan's ears, he saw hanging corpses from the branches of the withered trees in the forest. To be exact, they were dried corpses. These skins were not peeled off. It was as if some kind of evil spirit had sucked their bone marrow and internal organs dry. In the end, as if it was showing off its spoils of war, it hung them in the dead forest in such a disgusting manner. Wang Ling did a quick count of the number of dried corpses. As far as he could see, there were more than 1,200 corpses. Were they cultivators who had mistakenly entered the outer god palace? Wang Ling had a guess. If this outer god palace had drifted in the universe, it was very likely that some cultivators would have explored it as a secret place they had stumbled upon. This place was too strange. Wang Ling was worried that looking at it for too long would be bad for little girl Wan's physical and mental health. But just as he was about to leave the withered forest, the hanging corpses all changed their angles and stared in his and Wang Wan's direction. Identify, identify, an eerie sneer rang out in the withered forest. It was an ancient language Wang Ling had never heard before, and it was filled with great malice. But Wang Ling's ability to understand languages was extremely strong, and he only needed to analyze it in his mind to quickly translate it into Mandarin. Along with this cold sneer, the dried corpses hanging from the trees in the withered forest also laughed mockingly. This was a continuous mental oppression attack, and any cultivator who entered this place under such a concentrated attack would have already collapsed long ago. But Wang Ling stuck his hands in his pockets and didn't move. The owner of the sneer in the withered forest was a little surprised. You actually withstood the pressure and didn't collapse? The voice was very old and profound. I've never seen a cultivator like you, but you withstood the first round of the mental assessment and can leave this place unscathed. Mental assessment? Wang Ling raised his eyebrows. He actually didn't hear what the old voice was saying. But as the voice had said, after the concentrated mental attack just now, the dried corpses in the withered forest had miraculously disappeared like an illusion. The sneer and the eerie scene in the withered forest had all disappeared. Strength, mental strength, knowledge, speed, chi and blood, when everyone enters this outer god palace, these values are fixed. The old voice in the withered forest sighed helplessly. With a sinister smile, he explained the rules of this palace to Wang Ling. This is Lord Outer God's purpose in building this palace, and also a game for the whole universe. Unfortunately, since ancient times, very few cultivators who have broken into this place have been able to make it to the end. Wang Ling frowned slightly. Listening to these values, he felt that it really did feel like a game. And what were his 5 basic abilities of strength, mental strength, knowledge, speed, and chi and blood? Wang Ling didn't know about this yet. The old voice continued, how about it, do you want to make another bet with me? If you can pass my mental assessment, you'll know what your mental strength value is, and I'll die. If you can't, I'm sorry, but you and your sister will stay here forever. Both of you will die. Wang Ling didn't think too much about it, and just spread his hands, maintaining a completely indifferent attitude. The voice couldn't help laughing. You could have left unscathed, but I didn't expect you to choose to bet with me. Hee, we'll see. As soon as the voice fell, several golden rays of light appeared in the air, and Wang Ling saw 10 64-faced golden dice appear. They rolled and spun in the air before finally coming to a stop. The moment the values came out, the owner of the withered forest laughed. Unfortunately, your total value is 523. One value represents one nucleus. This means that you must have a mental strength of at least 523 nuclei to pass through this old withered forest. Laughter was inevitable. This was because everyone who entered the outer god palace would have their overall combat strength converted according to their personal ability, and then evenly distributed among the 5 basic abilities of strength, mental strength, knowledge, speed, and chi and blood. The cultivators who had entered in previous years might not even have a total of 523 nuclei, let alone this single value. Sorry, young man, this old man won't stand on ceremony with you and your sister. The owner of the withered forest laughed sinisterly. Wang Ling frowned. Just as he was about to fight, the owner of the withered forest suddenly let out a pained and shrill scream. No, this is impossible, the owner of the withered forest screamed. As far as Wang Ling could see, all the withered trees in the withered forest were instantly set ablaze by a kind of golden fire, and they started to burn. Your mental strength is actually at least 523 nuclei? The owner of the withered forest burst out in a questioning voice amidst the screams. He actually didn't know what Wang Ling's mental strength value was, but based on experience, it was basically impossible for someone to have such a high single value. After this questioning voice died down, Wang Ling's mental strength value also appeared in the sky along with a flash of golden light. It wasn't a specific number. Instead, it was a mathematical symbol. Infinity. Chapter 1589. As Wang Ling's mental strength assessment value appeared, the entire withered forest was instantly burned to ashes in a sea of golden fire, and the owner of the withered forest died a miserable death. He had confidently made this bet with Wang Ling, and hadn't expected this to be the result until his death. In fact, Wang Ling also hadn't expected the nomological system inside the outer god palace to actually be relatively fair. After the old man lost, he was directly punished by the nomological system without any room for negotiation. Was this the self-confidence of the outer gods in the ancient universe era? They wouldn't even let off their own people. Wang Ling couldn't help sighing helplessly in his heart. For the powerful outer gods, this was really just a game. In a game of chess, any chess piece could be abandoned. But this was someone else's territory, after all, and they had the final say in the rules of the game. Wang Ling just hoped that since these were the rules of the game, they would abide by them. He could afford to play this game. But some people might not be able to afford it. The withered forest disappeared in the golden fire, but it didn't mean that nothing was left behind. Wang Ling found a golden Rubik's Cube with 6 faces. 3 of the faces were white boards, 2 were 1 points, and 1 was 3 points. Wang Ling judged that this was probably an extra reward for clearing the withered forest. When he focused his gaze on the golden Rubik's Cube, a string of golden explanatory text appeared at the top of the cube. Golden magic block can be used before any of the basic abilities, strength, willpower, knowledge, speed, vitality, and the number of points you throw is a multiple of the basic ability's value. If it is a whiteboard, the result is 0. The golden magic block can only be used once, and will automatically disappear after use. Wang Ling put the magic block away. He didn't know what use this reward would have for him. He was already plus infinity, so it didn't matter if it was several times more. On the contrary, this thing was a double-edged sword for Wang Ling. After all, there was a whiteboard here, and if he threw it at it, it would be very dangerous for him. He was an honest kid. He still wanted to play the game according to the rules. If he couldn't handle it, he would flip the table. Was Wang Ling that kind of person? After dealing with the dead forest incident, Wang Ling was faced with 3 more doors covered in golden light. Without hesitation, he chose the door in the middle. A brand new small world appeared in front of them. It was a vast swamp, and the purple reeds were hundreds of feet tall, obscuring everything around them. Such a scene was filled with a wild and primitive feeling, and it was terrifyingly quiet. Based on his own experience, there had to be living creatures in the depths of this swamp. Wang Ling made a seal with one hand, and several sentinels with his aura spread out in all directions. When these sentries passed by the middle region of the small world, there was a strange fluctuation that directly bit towards his sentries. Ah, a blood-curdling scream rang out. It was so fast that it was shocking. But this scream didn't come from the sentinels he had released, but from the creature lurking at the bottom of the swamp. The creature wanted to launch a sneak attack and bite the sentinel to pieces, but it didn't expect the sentinel to be so tough. This caused its mouth of steel teeth to suffer heavy damage. Then, from a distance, Wang Ling and Wang Yuan could sense the creature's furious aura. In this swamp, no one had ever dared to play tricks on him like this. Then, the swamp in this small world began to bubble, emitting a thick stench of smoke. Accompanied by the furious aura of the swamp creatures, it began to boil. In the next instant, a black ray of light emerged from the ground and launched a sneak attack on Wang Ling's back from a strange angle. Rip! Wang Ling's six senses were sharp, and he didn't even turn his head as he raised his sword and waved it behind him. In an instant, sparks flew in all directions as the light shot out by the swamp creature was cancelled out. This probing attack had already allowed Wang Ling to ascertain the creature's general strength. The other party's overall battle strength wasn't strong, but the strange thing was that it was extremely fast. In this swamp world, this creature had the ability to move to any location at will. It quickly moved horizontally, and then launched a new attack under the layer of foul mud. Wang Ling stood on tiptoe and floated in the air. At the same time, he activated his king's eye, which released the eternal flame, which completely engulfed the reeds blocking his view and burned them to ashes. Without the cover of the reeds, the creature's movements could be said to be in plain view. As if realizing that it had been exposed, the mysterious creature hiding in the swamp finally revealed its true form. It was round and pitch black all over, and was 3 meters in diameter with hair and tentacles. It was actually another eyeball. With one glance, Wang Ling could tell that this eyeball was probably one of the old rulers. It was the same species as the ultimate hunter that he had dealt with outside, but it seemed a little different. At that moment, the eyeball appeared in Wang Ling's direction in a flash, and its pupils constricted slightly before widening. Then, a black ray of light shot toward Wang Ling with dense killing intent. This was an incomparably blazing pillar of fire, which gave Wang Ling the feeling that Angie had pulled a big one. Wang Ling wanted to block it with his hand, but little girl Nguyen acted first at that moment. It looked like this little girl was really hungry and couldn't let go of anything. She opened her mouth on the spot and used the power of shadow to swallow up the black flame in front of her. The eyeball was clearly shocked. It had lived for so long, but had never seen such an arrogant baby. It gnashed its teeth in exasperation. What a pity, I'm not at my peak, and only have a few scattered organs left. If I was at my peak, you two babies would have died without a doubt. The eyeball's voice rang out in Wang Ling and Wang Yuan's minds. After saying that, the eyeball turned slightly, and Wang Ling was stunned to find that it actually had the same mark as the one on the outside of the outer god's palace. It actually came from the outer god's eyeball? Wang Ling was lost in thought. At the same time, the eyeball felt bitter in its heart. In its heyday, it had indeed been a powerful outer god. It had to be known that among the old rulers, the outer gods were the most powerful race. And when the grave gods outside finally completed their metamorphosis, they would become outer gods. Unfortunately, in the long years of history, the eyeball had become obsessed with betting with others. As one of the few gambling dogs in the ranks of the outer gods, he had lost his left arm, left leg, and middle leg. Now, only parts of its organs and eyeball were left. But the eyeball was still obsessed with betting. The fact that this brother and sister pair in front of it had been able to come here meant that in terms of strength, the eyeball had to admit that it couldn't win. It had already tested them just now. So now, the eyeball officially invited Wang Ling for an appraisal. How about it, do you want to bet with me on speed? I want to have a speed appraisal with you. The eyeball was extremely confident in its speed. Because according to the appraisal rules of the outer god's palace, its speed was plus infinity. As long as Wang Ling dared to bet with it, he would definitely die. Chapter 1590. As one of the most powerful outer gods among the former rulers of the old days, the eyeball was extremely confident in its speed attribute. In terms of speed, it believed that there was no opponent in the world who could match it. The civilization of the ancient universe had been annihilated for too long, and at that time, they had been the leading overlords of the universe. As for the human cultivators who had sprung up later, in the eyes of the former rulers, they were nothing more than fodder to provide nutrients. Hia, but to the eyeball's surprise, Wang Wan actually laughed at that moment. Wang Ling was also startled by this sudden laugh. He suddenly realized that little girl Nguan and he were completely different in another way. Perhaps he had discovered it a long time ago, that this lass's expressions and emotions were much richer than his own. Little guy, how dare you laugh at me? The eyeball glanced at Wang Wan and glared at Wang Ling with disdain. At the same time, there was a little pity in it. As a human cultivator, there were actually very few people who could make it through this level. In the eyeball's view, it had already been very difficult for Wang Ling and Wang Wan to get through the dead forest up ahead. From a human cultivator's point of view, this pair of brother and sister were definitely at the top of the food chain. However, it was a pity that they were about to be buried here. Thus, its eyes were filled with pity and sorrow as it stared straight at Wang Ling and Wang Wan. It sneered in its heart. Laugh all you want, it's your turn to cry soon. Wang Ling agreed to the speed attribute appraisal. Just like the scene in the dead forest earlier, a six-sided die appeared in the air. The attribute for this level was based on the eyeball's speed attribute. That was to say, Wang Ling's speed attribute had to surpass the eyeball's. The six-sided die in the air now was in fact the effect of the golden devil block which Wang Ling had obtained earlier. This was a double-edged sword. Because it was very likely that Wang Ling would hit the white board. But the truth was that even if it didn't hit the white board, the eyeball wouldn't be the slightest bit afraid. It quietly waited for the result. When the die of the golden devil cube stopped at 3 points, it suddenly laughed. Kid, 3 times your attributes. Your luck is pretty good. But, he. It laughed very slyly. 3 times. It admitted that Wang Ling was indeed lucky. But so what if it was 3 times? Its attributes were plus infinity. You are a cultivator from Earth. Even if I give you 10 times the amount. 18 times. 30 times. You think you can kill me in seconds? The eyeball did not believe it at all. It sneered. Soon, the golden light in the void began to display the result of the eyeball's speed appraisal. It was a plus infinity symbol. Wang Ling wasn't surprised. He knew that if the eyeball dared to bet with him, it must be very confident. At this time, the eyeball laughed again. Kid, you didn't expect this, did you? You couldn't surpass me from the beginning. You 2 siblings should be able to provide me with good nourishment. As soon as it finished speaking, the result of Wang Ling's speed attribute appeared. Wang Ling's appraisal result, plus infinity plus infinity plus infinity plus infinity, because he would have 3 times more attributes. On top of his speed attribute, Wang Ling had 3 additional infinity symbols. In the void, the huge golden talisman blinded the dog eyes on the spot. The eyeball gasped. Such an appraisal result was unacceptable to the eyeball. In the blink of an eye, its pupils contracted and blood vessels sprayed out. They were as red as blood and emitted a kind of light that distorted the void. It couldn't believe that a lowly creature from Earth could actually surpass it in terms of speed. But unfortunately, in less than 3 seconds, a row of golden ancient characters appeared in the void, glistening and dazzling, carrying a type of pressure that could destroy the world. Then, with a hung-long sound, a streak of punishment directly descended, like a spear, streaking across the heavens. An unstoppable blow. Under this kind of pressure, the speed that the eyeball was so proud of lost its effectiveness. It kept changing its position, but this spear had already locked onto it and had some kind of tracking power. Rip. Black blood splattered everywhere as the spear pierced through the eyeball, and its brain juices burst on the spot like a pierced watermelon. Then, it swiftly began to perish, and along with the swamp under its feet, it turned into a pile of fine powder that dissipated in the small world. A black hole was left where the eyeball had disappeared, and Wang Ling could clearly hear the eyeball's resentful voice inside. Sothoth, you wanted to kill me a long time ago, but you let me suffer such humiliation. You will definitely receive retribution and punishment." As the eyeball's last words fell, the golden light of punishment in the void disappeared, and the small world became peaceful once again. The swamp was gone, and so was the reed marsh. And in front of Wang Ling were 3 brand new doors. The eyeball's words before it left lingered in Wang Ling's mind. In Wang Ling's opinion, this outer god palace was indeed unusual. Since the other party wanted to kill him, then he could totally cheat and force him to lose the match. But looking at the result now, Wang Ling somehow felt that there might be a deeper and more complicated reason behind this. These old rulers who had been sealed in the outer god palace as past lords all had extraordinary backgrounds. Although the eyeball was weak, it had once been an all-powerful outer god. But for what reason did they fall to such a state? This reminded Wang Ling of something. And that was Dao ancestor Wang's corpse wrapping picture. He felt that this method was similar to Dao ancestor Wang's method of forcibly sealing those ancient powerhouses who couldn't stand the sight of him into the supreme corpse wrapping picture. At that moment, Wang Ling called out to Zhang Zipei in his heart. The supreme corpse wrapping picture was now in Wang Ling's hands, and he had used a method to change the nomological laws to change its owner. In other words, Wang Ling was now the supreme corpse wrapping picture's owner. Back then, Wang Ling had seen Zhang Zipei look pensive when he saw his king's eye. It was only now that Wang Ling remembered that this Zhang Zipei might know something about the civilization of the ancient universe. The accumulated experience and knowledge of ancient powerhouses was very frightening. Zhang Zipei had his own vast knowledge. "You finally remembered me." Hearing Wang Ling's call, Zhang Zipei immediately sighed. Wang Ling, at that moment, the king's eye and the corpse wrapping picture formed a spiritual link. Only then did Zhang Zipei see what on earth was happening outside. The scene in front of him made Zhang Zipei frown slightly. Why does it look a little like an outer god palace? Wang Ling nodded his head noncommittally. Hearing this, Zhang Zipei's hair immediately stood on end. "How can you be so bold? This is a place of no return." But as soon as he said this, he realized that the situation in front of him wasn't what he had imagined. As far as he knew, entering an outer god palace meant certain death. But now, wasn't this youngster standing here perfectly fine? And with him was a baby girl lying on his shoulder, as soft as a ball of glutinous rice. Immediately after, Zhang Zipei gasped in shock. He felt that he had underestimated Wang Ling a little too much. Chapter 1591. Given Zhang Zipei's level of knowledge, he knew all too well what kind of place this outer god palace was. Back then, before he had entered the corpse picture, he had heard that Dao ancestor Wang had sent out his real identity to explore this mystical ancient universe palace. But none of his clones had returned. Since then, Zhang Zipei had started to investigate all the information about this palace. It was only later that he gradually learned that this was an outer god palace. At first, he had indeed wanted to break in, mainly because he felt that there might be something invaluable in the ancient universe palace that he could go in and make a killing. He had even deliberately released a lot of fake maps of the secret land to lure some ancient powerhouses to explore this outer god palace. In the end, no one had come out. Since then, Zhang Zipei had completely dispelled the idea of going to the outer god palace to work as a porter. Now, Wang Ling was standing in this outer god palace, safe and sound, without the slightest hint of panic on his face, which astonished Zhang Zipei. Judging from the basic speed and mental attributes that had been revealed so far, the youngster's attributes were plus infinity. To be honest, Zhang Zipei felt that this was a little outrageous. What a troublesome kid. Zhang Zipei sighed silently in his heart, then said, "I can only tell you what I know. I've only heard a lot about this outer god palace, and have never seen it with my own eyes." He crossed his arms and deliberately put on an air of seniority. "Although you haven't completed the task I assigned you as a condition for exchanging information, in this situation, I have no choice but to cooperate. I have no choice but to help you. After all, if you die here, my wish to find a descendant will come to nothing." Wang Ling hadn't expected this old man to be so tsundere. But in some sense, he thought Zhang Zipei was a very interesting person. After using the king's eye to transmit all the images of the battle, Zhang Zipei was particularly concerned about the name the eyeball had said before it died. Sothoth, Zhang Zipei frowned. It seems that the one outside has inherited the bloodline of this outer god. Ya? Wang Yuan asked. She spoke in baby language, but miraculously, Zhang Zipei actually understood her. Zhang Zipei nodded and said, very strong indeed. This outer god was ranked second among the outer gods back then. He was said to be omniscient and knew everything. It can connect time and space together, and is not bound by time and space. Yeah. Yes, this old man knows all this information from Tao ancestor Wang's notes. Although the Tao ancestor's true avatar did not come out of the outer god's palace, the investigation of the outer god's palace was effective. I'm afraid he passed on the information before he died. Zhang Zi whispered, you have to be careful, kid. After all, this Sothoth is ranked second among the outer deities. He's not easy to deal with. The outer god palace was his hinterland. In order to obtain great power, he didn't even hesitate to enslave his own race. The eyeball just now is the best example. Yes. Wang Ling nodded. He could actually feel it. This outer god palace was actually a huge pig farm. As for this outer god named Sothoth, he was probably an old servant. He used his outer god palace to enslave some of the great old ones. Then, he continuously absorbed energy from the outside and allowed these enslaved great old ones to devour these foreign creatures. Until the day they were fattened up. In the end, these enslaved rulers would also fall into the mouth of this giant abyss. And this was the outer god's pig farming plan mentioned in Tao ancestor Wang's notes. The ancient universe era was essentially the same as before the modern civilization of human cultivators had officially been established. It was an era of chaos. What it emphasized was the old law of the strong preying on the weak. Each outer god occupied a corner of the universe and then competed with each other. How cruel. Wang Ling sighed in his heart, his face expressionless. However, he did not barge into the outer god's palace to give food to the rulers of the past, but for the three-petaled golden lotus hidden in the palace. He asked Zhang Zi, but Zhang Zi rubbed his chin and racked his brains for a while, but couldn't make heads or tails of it. Are you talking about the three-petaled golden lotus? I think it's something from the ancient universe era. I've seen it in Tao ancestor Wang's notes before. Unfortunately, there were very few records of the golden lotus at that time, and there weren't any more clues. Zhang Zi had once broken into Tao ancestor Wang's residence several times in order to plunder his treasure. Apart from stealing that old god's heart, Zhang Zi felt that the most valuable thing he had now was Tao ancestor Wang's notes, which he had seen after breaking in a few times. He hadn't gone there for the sake of peeking into the notes. That was because Tao ancestor Wang's notes usually contained the coordinates of new secret realms in the universe. For cultivators who were eager to find immortal essence, these secret realms were paradises that could help them quickly improve their realms. So what Zhang Zi really wanted was actually the coordinates of these secret realms. As long as he drew up a treasure map and sold it, it would be enough for him to live a wealthier life than most 10,000 ancient cultivators without falling into a trap. Wang Ling had only just heard Zhang Zi mention these things. He didn't know that Zhang Zi had such a past. What Zhang Zi hadn't expected was that even though he hadn't said anything, Wang Ling actually hadn't forcibly searched his memories. For a youngster who didn't even care about an outer god's palace, if Wang Ling really wanted to forcibly search his memories, wouldn't it be a piece of cake? But the youngster in front of him hadn't done so. Zhang Zi had lived through the ages and had seen too many so-called experts who stood at the top and shook the world, looking down on others with their noses. They were aloof and arrogant, with the attitude of a damned mother. But after Zhang Zi got to know Wang Ling, he suddenly realized that the ancient experts he had known in the past weren't even 1/10,000th as elegant as Wang Ling. Are the true experts all gentle people? Zhang Zipi laughed bitterly in his heart. He had to admit that he had a good impression of Wang Ling. Even though the youngster didn't seem to have done anything to him. In modern terms, the youngster in front of him was old Asasai. Let's keep going. If there's anything I know, I'll definitely tell you, Zhang Zi said at that moment. He closed his eyes again with a fearless attitude. This new owner of the corpse picture in front of him gave him a great sense of security. In any case, he, Zhang Zi, was already a dead man. This was nothing more than risking his life to accompany the nobleman. If he died, it wouldn't be a loss. If Wang Ling could walk out of this outer god's palace alive, he would be a witness to history, and at the same time, he could brag about this for the rest of his life. I walked out of the outer god's palace, and I came out alive. At that moment, Wang Ling was choosing the next entrance. A purple feather condensed in the sky, then floated down and slowly stopped in Wang Ling's palm. This was the reward for clearing the second level, the Chaos Divine Feather. What surprised Wang Ling slightly was, this time, the reward wasn't a one-time item. Instead, it was a permanent chaos weapon. It was the same as the Supreme Corpse picture. Furthermore, the concentration of chaos in this Chaos Divine Feather was actually several times higher than that of the Supreme Corpse picture. Wang Ling felt that this could be considered a free material. He accepted it with satisfaction, and planned to go back to study it and use it as a strengthening material for Jinka. Chaos Divine Feather, ? Chapter 1592. When Wang Ling suggested using the Chaos Divine Feather as a material to upgrade his spirit sword, Zhang Zipi couldn't help breaking out in a cold sweat. He's just a kid after all, he's such a prodigal. This feather was many times more valuable than the Supreme Shrouding Corpse painting, and it was actually used to strengthen a spirit sword? What if the strengthening failed? Although Zhang Zipe was in the corpse wrapping painting, he was also an erudite and knowledgeable person. The imaginary world in the painting allowed Zhang Zipe to surf the internet in the corpse wrapping painting. This reminded him of the computer game he had played many years ago called Tainted Milk Powder. He was about to vomit from upgrading his equipment. If he failed, he would have to start all over again, because in the world of the shrouded corpse picture, Zhang Zipe couldn't directly top up his money. Therefore, his wealth in these modern online games was earned through playing games day after day. Cultivators could stay awake for long periods of time. In addition, Zhang Ziqin was essentially a dead man. Therefore, a dead man did not need to rest, nor did he need to worry about his liver being worn out after staying up late for a long time. Because Zhang Zistiel did not have a liver that could be worn out. After accepting the divine feather, Wang Ling's heart was as calm as an ancient well. He knew that Zhang Zidin was definitely cursing him for being a wastrel in his heart. But to be honest, Wang Ling had always had very high standards. This Chaos Divine Feather might be an extraordinary object in Zhang Ziba's eyes, but in Wang Ling's eyes, it was just a strengthening material that could be discarded. The truth was that Wang Ling was very serious. The value of this chaotic divine feather wasn't even as high as the corpse wrapping painting. Although the chaos in the corpse wrapping painting was not as concentrated as the Chaos Divine Feather, it was still a painting that had been passed down for thousands of years. In addition, there was a big shot like Zhang Zijin in the painting. With this map, Wang Ling could learn about cultivation secrets in the universe at any time that he didn't understand. These ancient experts whom Dao ancestor Wang had suppressed in the corpse picture back then were now Wang Ling's greatest repository of knowledge, and could be called a portable encyclopedia. Of course, the most important thing was, this corpse picture was under Wang Ling's control, so he wouldn't do anything unnecessary on his own. Just like the iPad book of Sage Immortal that he had already sent away. After passing the second test, the swamp area, he continued on his way. The small world in the third room was completely different from the previous two rooms. It wasn't as eerie and terrifying as the withered forest, nor did it have the mysterious aura of the swamp. This was a world filled with white mist. All kinds of multicolored lights were surging within the primal chaos. The misty world was full of danger. As Wang Ling drew closer, he could clearly sense that the multicolored light here was different. It was very heavy on his shoulders, a weight that ordinary cultivators would find hard to bear. But Wang Ling walked through the fog as if it were flat ground. His footsteps were so brisk that Zhang Zipei, who was in the corpse wrapping painting, kept calling him freak in his heart. This freak didn't mean anything else. He just felt that Wang Ling's strength was too heaven-defying, and couldn't help exclaiming in his heart. Walking through the mist, Wang Ling felt like he was watching an old movie, as if he had lived through several eras. Countless creatures that had gone extinct in the universe appeared before his eyes. He saw a girl riding a white jade qilin and an old man fishing for a void dragon with a straight hook. All sorts of miraculous scenes appeared before his eyes. This was not an illusion, but a real scene. Wang Ling's king's eye had the ability to separate the false from the real. If it was fake, these scenes would immediately split apart. Zhang Zipei watched the entire process with Wang Ling. He was dumbstruck and speechless. The scene in front of him was so strange that he didn't know what words to use to describe it. Mirror of reality and illusion? After a long while, he said these 4 words skeptically. Zhang Zipei remembered reading about it in Dao ancestor Wang's notes. There was this kind of miraculous secret land in the universe, which was constructed from the nomological laws of an almighty. Everything here had the effect of a cosmic photo album. All kinds of classic images from the development of the multiverse would be preserved, and then constantly played them in the secret land. These images looked like images, but were in fact visible and tangible. They were no different from real scenes. When the false becomes the real becomes the fake. Outer god Sotheth could easily create this world of reality and illusion, Zhang Zipei said. Sotheth was known as the omniscient and omniscient of the outer gods. He was proficient in the network of the universe, and could be said to be omniscient and knowledgeable about every inch of the universe. It wasn't difficult for such an unfathomable realm to create this mirror of reality and illusion. However, these seemingly beautiful scenes always made Zhang Zipei feel a little unreal. The outer gods had always regarded human cultivators as fodder, and were extremely hostile to them. If this mirror of reality and illusion had really been created by Sotheth, it should have recorded scenes of the glorious days when the great old ones had dominated the universe in the past, and sure enough. In the next second, as Zhang Zipei was feeling doubtful, the scene in front of him instantly changed. The smiling girl who had been riding on the white jade qilin, suddenly, the qilin she was sitting on turned around and bit her. The little girl screamed as the berserk white jade qilin directly bit her neck and crushed her head like a watermelon. It turned out that the great old ones had already implanted a type of parasitic spore under the qilin's curly hair. Nourished by the qilin's blood, the spore grew rapidly and gave birth to invisible tentacles that controlled the qilin to bite its owner to death. Then, these tentacles continued to devour the qilin until they finally became brand new, great old ones, with the help of the white jade qilin's body. As for the old man who had been fishing with a straight hook, he was in the same miserable state as the little girl. Yeah. Wang Yuan was a little nervous and couldn't help wrapping her arms around Wang Ling's neck. Wang Ling stretched out a hand and gently patted Wang Yuan on the back. The scene in front of them had indeed changed startlingly. It had been a harmonious scene just now, but in the blink of an eye, it had changed. I knew it would be like this. Zhang Zipei sighed. But the scene in front of him reminded Zhang Zipei of something else recorded in Dao ancestor Wang's notes. This was just Dao ancestor Wang's deduction, but after seeing the scene in front of him, Zhang Zipei felt that it made a lot of sense. Dao ancestor Wang's deduction said, it's very likely that the origin of humanity was a game played by the great old ones. The era of the ancient universe, which was the era when the great old ones ruled the universe, was far before human cultivators. Thus, it was reasonable to say that it was impossible for the great old ones and human cultivators to coexist. But the mirror of reality and illusion, in front of them clearly recorded the scene of the great old ones possessing those humans. The most likely answer was that in order to expand their race, the great old ones had used the power of nomological laws to build a new world of living beings. And these new living beings were humans. From God's perspective, they manipulated human cultivators and used them as their nourishment, which they continued to devour, until one day, the great old ones were destroyed for some unknown reason. And those, fodder, who were still alive turned over and became the new masters of the universe. Of course, this was just Dao ancestor Wang's own deduction. Even Zhang Zipei didn't have any more evidence to support this. Boring. Wang Ling gave a rare evaluation of Zhang Zipei's thoughts. Zhang Zipei said, "This is just a deduction. You know, old people like us are all conspiracy theorists." Dao ancestor Wang's words might not be completely correct. Wang Ling sighed. He clenched his fists, deep in thought. Perhaps in the entire universe, human civilization was so insignificant that it was just a drop in the ocean. Naturally, it couldn't be the most advanced civilization, and there was still a lot to be improved on. However, the emergence of the human cultivator civilization definitely wasn't a subsidiary of another evil old civilization. Was it actually using this mirror of reality and illusion to slander human civilization? Crispy noodle snacks were clearly so delicious. At that moment, Wang Ling was in the third level of the mirror of reality. A prompt appeared in the air again. The golden text indicated that Wang Ling needed to appraise his strength for this level, and he needed at least 3 plus infinity S to pass. But Wang Ling already felt that he was a little impatient with this game. 3 plus infinity S. At that moment, Wang Ling frowned. Then, he rolled up the sleeve of his right hand. When Zhang Zipei saw this, he instantly panicked. "You, what are you doing?" Wang Ling flashed his fist, which was the size of a sandbag. What was he doing? Of course it was to overturn this outer god palace. Chapter 1593. Wang Ling rolled up his sleeves and put on an expression as if he was ready to go all out. Zhang Zipei's first reaction was naturally astonishment. Even though his understanding of Wang Ling's strength had been refreshed not long ago. But he didn't think that Wang Ling could deal with the entire outer god palace with one punch. But now, seeing Wang Ling flick up his sleeve, Zhang Zipei deeply realized that he had still underestimated Wang Ling a little. Why would such a terrifying young man exist in this universe? When Zhang Zizai had seen Wang Ling's king's eye earlier, he had actually guessed it. This was because he could see that the king's eye was not part of the Tao and could not be replicated by the great Tao. Therefore, the first thing that came to Zhang Zipei's mind was, products of the past. If the king's eye was related to the great old ones of the ancient universe era, in that case, everything would make sense. After coming to this conclusion, Zhang Zizi had initially suspected that Wang Ling wasn't a normal human cultivator. He felt that there was an 80 to 90% chance that Wang Ling had the bloodline of the old rulers of the ancient universe. But now, Zhang Zik felt that his conclusion was completely wrong. Although there were wars and the law of the jungle among the great old ones. However, a place like the outer deity palace symbolized the supreme authority of royalty. It was a symbolic product that represented the glory of the ancient cosmic civilization of the old dominators, just like the feng shui dragon vein that the ancient human cultivators believed in when they established the empire. No matter how much they fought, nobody would attack such a thing. This was an action that would destroy the very foundation of their faith and race. Before Wang Ling had called him out, he had already passed 2 tests in a row. Zhang Ziqin originally thought that it was because the king's eye might be a product of the past, which was why it was so smooth sailing in the outer god palace. But now, after seeing the bad attitude of the great old ones towards humans, this young man actually rose up and wanted to smash the entire outer god palace with a punch from the inside. Was it really possible? Zhang Ziqin was completely dumbfounded. On the other side, Wang Ling was also gathering his strength. He knew that it was not easy to disintegrate the outer deity's palace from the inside, so he had to pay special attention to the power of this punch. His usual attacks were rather casual. It was probably not enough to deal with the outer god palace. Admittedly, Wang Ling was also considering whether or not to remove the Tao talisman. He felt that he could reveal it, but there was no need. It was just destroying a house. It was not to the point where he had to unseal the talisman. At that moment, he took a deep breath. A few seconds later, golden light condensed on his fist. Countless strands of chaotic force gathered at the center of his fist like a whirlpool. In an instant, the surrounding space boiled. The real fog produced by the mirror of illusion was dispersed by the golden light that the youth condensed. At the eye of the fist, Zhang Zi could clearly feel that the concentration of chaos was soaring. Chaos was originally purplish-black in color. Only when the density reached a certain limit would it turn golden. It can actually reach this stage. Zhang Ziba was completely shocked. Who would have thought that the primordial chaos that Wang Ling had condensed at this moment would already far surpass that of Dao ancestor Wang back then? In just a few seconds, the concentration of primal chaos had reached an astronomical figure. He was tens of thousands of times more terrifying than Dao ancestor Wang of the past. Furthermore, this was only the beginning. He still hadn't reached his limit. Clang! A melodious bell rang out. It wasn't the voice of the outer divine palace, but a powerful fluctuation coming from the center of the universe, which resonated with Wang Ling in that moment. This time, it wasn't just Zhang Ziba, the other ancient powerhouses in the Supreme Corpse wrapping painting couldn't sit still either. They stared at the scene in front of them, stunned and pale. A faint golden silhouette appeared behind the youth, supreme and supreme. A golden magic ring above its head, and golden primal chaos fog at its feet. It was just an indistinct silhouette, but the minds of countless ancient powerhouses in the Supreme Corpse wrapping painting short-circuited for a brief moment, because they knew what on earth this thing that looked like a substitute behind Wang Ling was. This is a Dharma. This youth's Dharma is actually the spirit of the universe? Inside the Supreme Corpse wrapping painting, many of the ancient powerhouses couldn't help kneeling. It wasn't that they wanted to kneel, but that it was a natural reaction from their bodies when they saw the spirit of the universe. This was the most powerful Dharma object. It symbolized a kind of supreme, noble, and inexhaustible power. Clang! Just as everyone was in a daze, the bell rang out a second time. This was the fluctuation that followed the appearance of the spirit of the universe. It sounded like a bell, but was in fact the result of powerful energy spreading through the universe. If the universe was a zither, then all the planets in the universe were the strings. Wang Ling's spirit of the universe was the person plucking the strings. When the bell rang for the third time, an even greater fluctuation spread out, and the surrounding space and time were thrown into chaos. The sound of the bell was like a countdown that reverberated through the universe. It was a sign that something big was about to happen. This is the death knell of adjudication. Zhang Ziba was quite surprised. This was because he had learned about the judgment knell from Dao ancestor Wang's notebook. Back then, Dao ancestor Wang had tried to summon the spirit of his Dharma with tremendous power to produce fluctuations and activate the death knell of adjudication. But in the end, Dao ancestor Wang had failed. Who knew that this scene would actually happen here? Death knell of adjudication? What's that? Someone in the Supreme Corpse wrapping painting asked. Not all 10,000 ancient powerhouses had Zhang Zidan's experience and knowledge. That's a verdict from the universe. It represents the will of primal chaos. Zhang Ziba explained. In fact, he couldn't say for sure what it was. But every time the death knell of adjudication rang out, it would give people an indescribable feeling of palpitation. It was as if the universe was about to collapse. All the fear, shock, and bewilderment added together took Wang Ling just a few short seconds to build up his strength. While he was building up his strength, the nomological laws of Outer God's palace noticed that something was wrong, and tried to condense a stream of primal chaos to destroy Wang Ling with the power of Outer God's order, but the stream was swallowed up by the spirit of the universe. At that moment, this illusory silhouette manifested its supreme position. It's here. When Wang Ling opened his eyes, a devastating fist light shot out from his hand. Boom! A huge penetrating beam of light shot out from his fist and pointed straight at the void in front of him. This was a kind of power condensed from the center of the universe, and everything in its path collapsed. The space of the mirror of illusion shattered on the spot, and the fog was purified by the golden light. As the death knell of adjudication rang out for the fifth time, everything in its path was destroyed and collapsed. Chapter 1594. Zhang Zik stared dumbstruck at the scene in front of him. The outer god palace shook and everything seemed to be on the verge of collapse. Then, he heard the sound of something cracking inside the palace, as if something was about to collapse. One punch and the outer god palace collapsed. Inside the supreme corpse winding up painting, all the ancient powerhouses turned pale with shock. Who would have thought that such an invincible youngster would appear after all these ages? The outer god palace, that was the ancient space civilization, the symbol of the highest power among the great old ones, it was also the symbol of hegemony. No one had expected the outer god palace to collapse with one punch from Wang Ling, as brittle as a piece of tofu. The supreme nomological laws of the outer god were so powerful that they crisscrossed the palace like an electric net and could punish everything that dared to disrespect them. But in front of Wang Ling, these nomological laws were useless. The broken outer god palace was no longer calm. Boom! Thousands of pitch-black tentacles emitted blazing chaotic light as they seeped in through the cracks in the outer god palace. The form collapsed, but the spirit didn't die. Before the outer god palace completely disintegrated, it gathered the last of its godly power for a counterattack. After all, it was something from the ancient universe era, and Wang Ling had actually expected this level of toughness. Wang Ling's expression was as still as an ancient well. Because this was already the best he could do. At that moment, the outer god palace was completely dark, giving Wang Ling the illusion that he was in the dark. In this moment of absolute darkness, these thousands of thick tentacles swiftly stretched out in all directions with the terrifying power of godly punishment. Wang Ling raised his hand and caught a few of the tentacles that were lashing at his face. Then, he pulled them out and roasted them before feeding them to little girl Nguan, who was starving on his shoulder. The hunter of the end's tentacles weren't delicious, but Wang Ling judged that the flesh of these tentacles, which had the effect of godly punishment, would definitely be very good. They weren't on the same level in terms of power alone. Thus, the meat would definitely be high in protein and very chewy. Of course, the most important thing was that the moment these tentacles lashed at him, Wang Ling could sense the aura of the sea. He judged that these were probably the godly punishment tentacles that the outer god palace had split from the sea of consciousness with the last of its will. To put it bluntly, the sea of consciousness was also a sea. Since it was seafood from the sea, it definitely tasted salty. In fact, Nguan was starving. Even if the tentacles didn't taste salty, she could still eat them. But now that it had a flavor, it was naturally the icing on the cake. Most importantly, she realized that her brother did not lie to her. The god's punishment tentacles were really delicious. It was many times chewier than the tentacles of the final hunter. Little girl Nguan couldn't describe the texture, but after Wang Ling tasted it after roasting it, it felt a little like squid noodles. It was the kind of scene that appeared in gourmet anime, where the chewy cuttlefish minced meat was stuffed into the noodles to increase the chewiness and texture. It had to be said that the soft and chewy texture of the divine punishment tentacles was indeed addictive. At this moment, the ancient powerhouses in the corpse picture were once again stupefied by Wang Ling and Wang Nguan's actions. This pair of brother and sister was too terrifying. Speaking of which, they were all born on Earth, but they didn't seem like Earthlings at all. Even the outer deity palace's divine punishment stripe was not spared. In fact, it wasn't just the ancient experts in the painting that were confused. The divine punishment tentacles that had attacked Wang Ling and Wang Nguan were also a little confused. When the Wang siblings began to swallow the tentacles into their stomachs, in this darkest moment, all the restless creatures in the surroundings instantly quietened down. The divine punishment tentacles were stupefied. They had just evolved to punish Wang Ling with the outer deity's will, but in the end, Wang Ling had directly grabbed their tentacles, directly cut them off, roasted them, and eaten them. This was done so skillfully that no one could understand it at all. For a moment, all the divine punishment tentacles stopped what they were doing and fell into a temporary daze. They were the divine punishment tentacles. They represented the will of the outer deities. Could it be that they didn't care about face? There was no doubt that Wang Ling's behavior was full of provocation. He was tarnishing the last of the divine punishment will of the outer deity palace, and practically didn't give them any leeway at all. After more than 10 seconds of dead silence, little girl Nwan, who was addicted to eating, no longer maintained her image as an obedient baby, and began to gorge herself. One in her left hand and one in her right hand, the sound of her chewing sounded like the echo of a demon. At this point, the outer deity palace began to riot again. Who would have thought that a newborn baby girl would be so arrogant? They couldn't deal with Wang Ling, but it seemed that they could use this baby as an example. Thus, even more divine punishment tentacles, numbering in the hundreds of thousands, surged out of the crack and split into two groups to attack Wang Ling and Wang Nuan. At that moment, a shocking scene appeared. Little girl Nuan, who was happily eating the divine punishment tentacles, actually grew rapidly in a short period of time. Wang Ling had actually noticed this when he had eaten the Hunter of the End's tentacle outside the outer deity palace earlier. At first, he thought it was an illusion, but now it seemed that he hadn't seen it wrong. Little girl Nuan's body was indeed growing bigger. But it wasn't the kind of growth that was possible, it was merely a doubling of her current body's size. In less than a minute, little girl Nuan's infinitely strong body had actually grown to more than 100 feet tall. She was still lying on the ground like a baby, and the milky scent of her body instantly filled the entire space before it flowed out of the crack in the outer deity palace. Is there too much energy? Zhang Zizai was dumbfounded. Wang Ling very quickly realized what was going on in front of him. Although little girl Nuan looked no different from a real person, she was essentially the incarnation of little girl Nuan's shadow. Shadows could expand infinitely to begin with. When they absorbed too much energy, their bodies would naturally expand infinitely. Outside the outer deity palace, the grave god had already sensed something strange in the palace. He had actually thought that an outer deity palace might not be able to trap Wang Ling. His initial goal had been to delay Wang Ling so that he would have enough time to complete the final resurrection step. But the grave god hadn't expected this pair of siblings to break out so quickly. What was even more unexpected was that at that moment, he actually saw an enormous baby's chubby little hand directly pierce through the outer deity palace with a rumble and stretch out from the top. The grave god, who was inheriting the power of outer deity Sothatha's bloodline, was utterly astonished. You're tuning in to the Dreamy Love Stories YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.